Hello and welcome everyone, it's the Black Rose here, and today we're diving into the greatest mystery in all of Elder Scrolls. What really happened to the Dwemer? An entire civilization gone instantly without a trace. This mystery dates all the way back to Morrowind, and even after decades of theories, we still don't have a clear answer. Well, that changes today. Despite the common nickname for them, dwarves, the Dwemer weren't anything like typical fantasy dwarves. In this universe, they're actually a species of elves, much like the Dunmer and Altmer we know from the games. The word Dwemer actually means deep elves, a name that reflects both where they lived and how they were very intellectual beings. They built vast underground cities and mastered advanced technology, the likes of which were beyond anything any other civilization in Elder Scrolls has ever been close to capable of. Possibly because they pursued knowledge no one else dared to. Yet at the height of their power, they vanished. This was thousands of years before the events of Skyrim, during the Battle of Red Mountain in the First Era. Every single Dwemer disappeared at the exact same moment, with the exception of Yagrim Bagarn, who we're going to talk about in this video. Some say their leader, Kagrenac, struck the heart of Lorkham with his tools. Others claim it was Dagoth-Ur. Regardless of who it was, that final strike upon the heart seems to be the cause of the Dwemer's disappearance. But how? What did that strike do that caused the mass vanishment of their whole civilization? And while their disappearance is kind of the big kahuna of the Dwemer mysteries, it's not the only one. There are actually conflicting accounts about their origins as well. Where did they come from? What were they really trying to achieve with all their advanced technology? And what exactly was tonal architecture, the strange science that seems to have been the key to everything? In this video, we're going to cover all of it, from their expansion across Morrowind, Skyrim, Hammerfell, and parts of High Rock, all the way to the deeper questions most people overlook. And at the end, I'm going to walk you through the theory that ties everything together, their origins, their grand plan, and most of all, their disappearance. You see, all of Tamriel's elves, or Merkind as they're often called, are supposedly descendants of this progenitor race called the Aldmer, who inhabited what's now the Somerset Isles in the Merethic era. They had a very prosperous society, but it wasn't without its flaws. Things like wealth and status determined how someone's life was going to go before it even started. So one day, this man named Veloth came along and called the Aldmeri society out on these flaws, saying it was based on greed, and that people ought to be rewarded for being good, not for being savvy or simply having been born lucky. So, Veloth rallied the less fortunate Aldmer under worship of what we call the Good Daedra, which are Mephala, Boethia, and Azura. Veloth's following became known as the Velothi. The Aldmeri factions in power at the time saw this movement was gaining momentum, so they took action against it. Veloth responded by leading his Velothi on a mass exodus. They sailed to continental Tamriel and made their way across the continent to the land of Resdawn, what we now call Morrowind. And once there, they became the Chimer, or Changed Ones. So were the Dwemer a group that split off from these Velothi? Well, this is where things get weird. Most sources claim that the Dwemer, and their kingdom Dwemerith, were already established in Morrowind when the Velothi arrived and formed Resdawn. One source that claims this is Pocket Guide to the Empire, 3rd edition, Somerset. According to the traditions of Somerset, the Aldmer who went to be free on the mainland became the disparate elven folk of history, Chimer, Bosmer, Aeliad. The ones who stayed behind became the Altmer. Even the earliest records of Somerset, however, shed no light on the origins of the Dwemer, who already occupied the northeast of Tamriel when Veloth and his people arrived there. The Morrowind section claims this as well. The earliest civilization of which there are records is that of the Dwemer, sometimes called dwarves by the ignorant. The Dwemer were remnants of the early Aldmer who had settled the coast and developed a highly sophisticated and technological culture. The rule of the Dwemer in Morrowind was contested by another group of Mer, the Chimer. The Chimer were like the Dwemer, descendants of the Aldmer, and had followed their prophet Veloth across Tamriel from the west. So this source suggests that the Dwemer were indeed descendants of the Aldmer, but were settled in Morrowind before the Velothi arrived. However, an earlier PGE, Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition, Hammerfell section, makes a more interesting assertion. Before quitting this subject, we might as well address the oft-used misnomer for the Dwemer, the dwarves. There is nothing to suggest that the Dwemer were any less towering over humans than the early Aldmeri were. Indeed, extant dwarven goldmail more or less fits every human lucky enough to possess it. Imperial excavation of ancient and wondrous dwarven machinery supports the dialectic theory that the translation of Dwemer as Deep Elves might instead be read as Smart Elves, despite the incongruity of that notion. Perhaps then, the brilliant students of the titanic Elnathe mentioned in the Onuad are the dwarves, and that their giant masters gave them this sobriquet. So this source suggests that the Dwemer were students of the Elnathe, the very first mortals of this universe, which would mean that they somehow existed before the old and wandering Elnathe became the first humans and elves. How could that be if the Dwemer are elves? This bizarre contradiction is further referenced in an old forum post from Michael Kirkbride, the former BGS dev who was one of the primary writers for these PGEs, and he sheds some light on what exactly the Dwemer learned from the Elnathe. As the Dwemer learned much of how to defy the Earthbones from watching Elnathe who controlled things such as decay and the passage between Mundus and other realms, the Bosmer learned from watching the passing of Ifri. So the Earthbones are essentially the laws of nature in Mundus, the plane of existence that Tamriel resides in, and the Dwemer science known as Tonal Architecture involves manipulating these Earthbones. I'll leave you with that for now, but we will return to this subject later. Some of you might know that I'm not the only YouTuber who's recently taken an interest in the Dwemer. Scott and Michael from Fudge Muppet recently made a fantastic video where they shared some interesting theories about the Dwemer's origins that I think we should discuss. The first one involves something referenced in the Altmeri Heart of the World story in the Monomyth. It references this kingdom called Altmora, and this Altmora is more than likely what's commonly called Atmora, the continent that Ysgramor and the 500 came to Skyrim from. So this source seems to be suggesting that the elves actually had a civilization there before the humans, and that Lorkhan and his human army conquered it in the Dawn Era. It also claims that there were elven survivors that fled south and east from Altmora, so the Fudge Muppet duo suggests that the Dwemer and Snow Elves could be descendants of those refugees, and they have some very interesting sub-theories branching from that. However, while this is a terrific theory, I find it unlikely for a few reasons. First, the earliest sources that reference this Altmora kingdom come from the Altmer. That's convenient, isn't it? Right, and Altmer sources are known to have a strong bias in favor of traditional elven cultures and against humans. So I think it's just as reasonable to assume that some of the early Altmer, or maybe even Aldmer before them, made up this Altmora kingdom to assert that humans have always been this evil aggressor, as their sources often do. Based on my research, I actually don't even think that Elnathe evolved into humans and elves until long after the war being referenced in this story. I think early Altmer, or again maybe even Aldmer sources, assert that happened sooner than it really did to assert that elves have always been the victims of human ambition, which supports their ever-present elven supremacist ideology that still plagues their culture thousands of years later. And I think they made up this south and east line precisely because it could lead readers to believe that Snow Elves and Dwemer are descendants of these Altmora elves, as in they intentionally lined up a story that makes sense to make it believable. Second, we know what the Dwemer looked like from Yager Magarn and the Dwemer Ghosts of Morrowind. Also, more recently, Kirkbride gave his approval to this fan art of the Dwemer, and in all these instances, we see that they have a very clear visual resemblance to the Chimer and Dunmer. So I find it unlikely that these Merkinds could have this much genetically in common if they have this split in their ancestry that goes back to even before the Aldmer. However, I do think there's more to their blood relation than meets the eye, hint hint. And third, if you've been watching me for a long time, then you know that I have a theory about the origin of Atmora that I'm pretty confident in, and the existence of this Altmora would be inconsistent with it. I'll do a brief roundup of it. This is one of those things that ties into all my theories about Lorkhan, the Elnathe, Hircine, Kine, the Giants, and so on. Something a lot of fans don't know about the Nords is that most of them actually believe that Skyrim is where their ancestors, the first humans, are originally from. They believe that all non-Yakutan human life started in Skyrim, moved to Atmora, and eventually returned to Skyrim with Ysgramor in the 500. In Nordic myths, it's commonly said that Kine breathed life onto the land from atop the throat of the world, and this formed the first humans. So how'd they end up on Atmora from there? Well, the stories vaguely say that the War of Manifest Metaphors somehow broke Nirn's original landmass apart into the continents that we now know, but they never specify any sort of cataclysmic event that caused this. So maybe rather than one singular event causing every continent to break off from Tamriel, we're talking about a few different events that caused each individual continent to break off. So what was happening toward the end of the war? Well, the Altmeri Heart of the World story in the Monomyth says that Lorkhan was leading a large portion of his army south toward Old Elnathe. And many of you know that I theorized the figure being referred to as Lorkhan in this instance was actually Hircine, impersonating the Lorkhan that Kine married before all this. So while Hircine was leading his legion toward Old Elnathay, Kyne found out that he was an imposter and made a plan of her own. She found a way to secure the safety of the soldiers that were loyal to her regardless of the outcome of the war, which was splitting the land that's now at Mora off from Tamriel to serve as their temporary home, until it was time for them to return to Tamriel and exact revenge on the many parties that she felt had betrayed her. After all, she does come up in lore about the Sea of Ghosts, so perhaps it exists because of her. Let's revisit her supposed act of creating humans. The Nords believe men were formed on this mountain when the sky breathed onto the land. They call Skyrim the throat of the world because it is where the sky exhaled on the land and formed them. Neither of these two sources actually name Kyne, they just refer to her metaphorically with the word sky. So, at least part of this is a metaphor, so maybe the whole thing is a metaphor. The sky breathed onto the land, the sky exhaled on the land. Is there some kind of power associated with Kyne that one might refer to as exhaling or breathing? Yes, there is, shouting. So how does this all fit together? Perhaps Kyne unleashed a massive godly shout at the land that's now Atmora to push it away from what's now Skyrim. Then the wandering Elnathay on Atmora evolved into the Atmorans, and the ones that were left on Tamriel, Hircine's loyalists, eventually became something else. Thus, this act of the sky breathing onto the lands to create humans that comes up in myths is really a metaphor for Kyne's act of setting this chain of events in motion that eventually led to humans. Moreover, I think Kyne had additional motives for doing this. Something that I picked up on in sources like the PGEs and the Improved Emperor's Guide to Tamriel is there's this repeated emphasis on the purity of Nordic blood. So I think that Kyne's whole ordeal with her husband being executed by Auriel and Hircine tricking her made her racist toward their followers, so she pushed Atmora away from Tamriel in order to prevent her followers from interbreeding with theirs. So yeah, that's a good synopsis of my theory for Atmora's origin. I think that Kyne used Hircine's march to Old Elnathay as an opportunity to secure safety for her loyalists, and to prevent them from interbreeding with followers of Auriel and Hircine, which makes the existence of this Atmora place seem unlikely given that the continent of Atmora didn't even exist yet. Though I want to be sure to give Scott and Michael credit here, I do think that they've made a discovery, just not the one they thought they'd made. They discovered a fake Dwemer origin story, not a real one. Another thing the Fudge Muppet team suggested is that the Dwemer could be survivors of a previous Kalpa, like the Elnathay and the Hist. But I have some issues with this too. I don't 100% agree with their interpretation of the Kalpic cycle. That's a subject I'll definitely do a deep dive on eventually. However, despite that disagreement, I actually do think they're right about the Hist and Elnathay being from a previous Kalpa. That's something that Kirkbride has toyed with community posts and stuff before. But if the Dwemer are from a previous Kalpa, then why aren't they mentioned in sources like the Anuad alongside the Hist and Elnathay? Well, we could make a case that it's the result of bias. You see, the origin of the Anuad isn't precisely known, but it's suggested to have originated from the Aelids. And supposedly, when they fell to the Alessian Empire, the Alessians made a big effort to erase all Aeliad writings, but were unable to completely get rid of this one because it was too widespread. However, the versions that we have from the games are all abridged. The full version has never been released by Bethesda. So I'll propose a possibility here. Maybe since Alessia knew she couldn't completely erase this story, she instead had her scribes write these abridged versions of it to obscure certain details to favor her new imperial cult religion. And she intentionally didn't mention the Dwemer having existed in this previous Kalpa alongside the Hist and Elnathay because she didn't want to confirm that elves existed before humans. It's an interesting idea, but there's one major assertion that the Anuad makes that isn't changed that I definitely think Alessia would have changed if this were true, and that's that Tamriel is what's left of the original Old Elnathay civilization. Elves are descendants of the Old Elnathay, and humans are descendants of the Wanderers that lived outside that civilization. So this fuels the whole elven supremacist ideology, and it doesn't have to, because this probably isn't even true. Most sources claim that Old Elnathay became a continent called Aldmeris, and that's where the Aldmer originally came from, and I think that's more than likely to be true, because when we consider what most sources say about the elves and how they've migrated over, thousands of years, like, the most sensible story we can put together is that, yeah, this Aldmeris place exists, and that's where the Aldmer came from. So I threw this Alessian interference idea I came up with in here just because I thought it was interesting enough to, but ultimately I don't think it's right. There's also another problem with this Kalpa survivors theory, and that's the clear resemblance between the Dwemer and the Chimer/Dunmer. That gets a lot harder to explain if the Dwemer are from a previous Kalpa. Not impossible, but definitely harder. However, while I don't think this theory is correct, I do think Scott and Michael are bordering on some right ideas here, which we'll get to as we proceed. Another curious detail about the Dwemer is they had some sort of relationship with the Giants. This is referenced in a few sources, and the giant can be found in the ruins of Blackreach. In fact, the common misnomer, dwarves, is said to have come from the Giants, since they were small compared to them. The Giants are a mystery themselves, which I've covered before. A common theory for their origin, which some sources do directly claim, is that they came to Tamriel from Atmora alongside the Atmorans that eventually became the Nords. However, the theory that I landed on is that they are descendants of the wandering Elnathe, but not from Atmora. They're descendants of ones that were left behind on Tamriel when Kine split Atmora off from the mainland. So in regards to all this, there's a curious post we should discuss from Gary Noonan. For those who don't know, he's been an animator and artist at Bethesda for 29 years. So he was around when Kirkbride, Coleman, and the whole gang came up with a lot of the early concepts for Elder Scrolls. Though I want to make sure to note that I think he sometimes doesn't remember things quite right and makes some mistakes in his wording, so we have to read this carefully. I'm just going to read this as it's written, but be aware that Gary has made some typos here. This myth and legends takes place long, long ago, before the Empire was established, and even before the Northerners touched foot on Tamrielic shorelines. Elves, Dwemer, were the predominant race of the continent, alongside the much smaller races of beastmen. A traveling band of elves were crossing through a mountainous range in the northeastern region of Tamriel. They encountered a friendly group, giants, and established relations amongst the two races. The giants had never encountered any human-like races, and were bewildered at the small appearance of the elves. The towering giants stood many, many heads over them. The elves, of course, were really not too much different in appearance or size than a typical human, but the giants were not aware of this since they had never seen a human. The giants labeled the elves as dwarves, claiming that they were just smaller versions of themselves. Over several years, this tag became a widespread label, and these elves were known as dwarves. The Dwemer translation of the word dwarf is Dwemer, so strangely enough, all Dwemer would use the term Dwemer, while the Northerners, newcomers, referred to this ancient race as dwarves, taking on the translation of the giants. It is unknown, but perhaps the newcomers encountered the Gnats before they did the elves. Little is known as to the significance of this legend, but it is told to children all over Tamriel. Many would swear by it, while many others will claim it is simply a bogus story. More info on the Dwemer can be found in the Pocket Guide and even in Redguard. What I find very interesting about this is it places giants on Tamriel before the arrival of the Atmorans, which is in line with my theory about their origin. But there is history between the giants and Atmorans. We know that Ysgramor and the 500 were actually enemies of at least one giant clan, and the Ysgramor's chosen body markings in the SO definitely bear a resemblance to the markings giants paint on rocks and that people paint their cattle with to offer them to giants. But this doesn't necessarily tie them to the Atmorans genetically. This could be out of veneration or reverence for them. After all, the standard body paint most resembles what farmers paint on cattle when they're offering them to giants, which they eat. So, I'm wondering if the idea here is that they used to selectively eat Atmorans by identifying them with this body paint to avoid accidentally eating races that were friendly towards them, like the Dwemer and Snow Elves. And thousands of years later, modern giants still know that this paint means you eat this, which is like how it's somehow evolved into people paint their cattle with it to make sure giants understand to eat it. Could be, and considering that and everything else, I'm sticking to my theory that giants are descendants of wandering Elnathe that were forsaken by Kine. But why were the Dwemer so interested in the giants? Could they have known something about them that we don't? Well, this could tie back to the claims that the Dwemer studied under the Elnathe. Maybe the giants are the closest remaining relatives to the wandering Elnathe, so once the actual Elnathe were gone, the Dwemer figured the giants would be the next best thing to study. Another idea is it could pertain to tonal architecture. Maybe some sort of tonal event rendered these big fellas the simple creatures that they are now. After all, the Dwemer do seem to have done something like that to the Snow Elves, so maybe that wasn't an isolated incident. Regardless of the truth as to why this friendship existed, I do like the idea of the extremely intellectual Dwemer being friends with the huge and pretty simple-minded giants. Now let's lean more into what the Dwemer were actually like, their beliefs and culture. So this subject is quite an enigma to say the least. Most of the vision behind the Dwemer was written by Michael Kirkbride. He was the main lore writer spanning from the development of Redguard to Morrowind. During that era of Bethesda history, he expanded Elder Scrolls into what it is now, with the help of other devs at the time. Really, Morrowind is where he went all out with his super philosophical and astral lore, which played a huge role in that game's main storyline. Since leaving Bethesda, Kirkbride has also written lots of unofficial sources and forum posts about the Elder Scrolls games. We always have to be careful with sources like that, but for this particular subject, we should take all his insights seriously, because the Dwemer, it's his thing, he came up with this. Also, Bethesda has actually canonized some of his unofficial works before, like Heimskir's sermon about Talos in Whiterun that comes from one of these unofficial Kirkbride posts. So Kirkbride often uses the character of Vivec as his in-universe voice to shed light on all this, especially in Morrowind-era stuff, and fans quickly surmised that some of the core concepts he came up with toy with the fourth wall. And I get that not everyone loves that kind of thing because it can be derivative, but Kirkbride does it in such a unique way that I think is absolutely brilliant. So even if it's not your thing, I highly recommend that you just give it a chance. A lot of it is actually based on how the Elder Scrolls universe is a series of video games. For example, a concept that comes up a lot in his lore is the Wheel, which is a representation of the Elder Scrolls world, the Arbus, and NPCs can see it through meditation. There's also the Tower, which is the wheel turned on its side. Both the wheel and tower are sometimes depicted in architecture throughout the games, like the Imperial City. And the Tower is also sometimes referred to as the letter I, because it represents the self as a being, as an I. But Kirkbride's idea here is that what NPCs like Vivec describe as the wheel is actually the game disc. Think about what it represents. It's the Arbus, which means gray maybe. So gray, a gray wheel, well, a disc is kind of like a gray wheel, right? And also maybe, well, it only becomes a game when that potential is realized, when we put the disc in the console and start playing. Though that hasn't aged super well, has it? Because now most players have completely digital copies of the games. But yeah, a lot of the astral concepts that Kirkbride and friends came up with for Elder Scrolls are based on this fourth wall idea with the Elder Scrolls characters being inside a video game. Particularly with Morrowind-era hardware and software in mind, since that's what was current at the time, so we're talking, the original Xbox. Though of course when we're quote-unquote breaking the fourth wall, we're really still in fiction. For instance, in the Lego movie, there's the Lego world, then there's also that fictional world that's supposed to be our world where Will Ferrell and his son are, they're closing out the movie. But it's not really our world, it's still in the movie, you know what I mean? So to better understand these Elder Scrolls concepts, I've named each of these worlds. There's our world, where we play the games and where Bethesda makes the games. Then there's the in-game fictional world that we see on screen. Then there's the fourth wall fictional world, where the idea is that it's our world, but really it's, it's still fictional. And that's where I believe the wheel and tower really are. Now that we've established those categories, we should talk about Kirkbride's approach to skepticism, which a lot of these Elder Scrolls concepts, well really all fourth wall breaking concepts are kind of based on. Skepticism is the belief or doubt that the world we live in is 100% real. René Descartes and David Hume are typically credited as the pioneers of this philosophy, and Kirkbride draws a lot of influence from them both. Though he's far from the first fiction writer to base stories on it, the most famous franchise to do this is probably The Matrix, which is a great example to have in mind because it uses a similar structure to what Kirkbride did for Elder Scrolls, which I call layered worlds theory. So you know the episode of Rick and Morty when they're in a simulation? It's called M. Night Shyamalians. It's season 1 episode 4, and to this day it's still one of my favorite episodes. That one's hilarious. Right, so Rick was in a simulation made by those aliens, but then it turns out he's within another simulation within that one, then he's in another simulation within that one too, and yeah, I don't remember how many times this goes on, but you get the idea. So the Elder Scrolls universe is sometimes depicted as the wheel, particularly by Vivec, which helps ground where all the various planes of existence are in relation to each other. The outermost layer is Aetherius, where the Atata are originally from, then Lorcan convinced a lot of them to create Mundus within that one, but some Atata went in their own direction and created the Planes of Oblivion between the two. So the Arbus looks like this wheel in the fourth wall fictional world. It's a fictional representation of the game disc, like Will Ferrell's live-action character in the Lego movie. But within the in-game universe that we see on the screen, really all these layers are spherical. We can see that when we look at the orrery in the Imperial City. But little do the characters in there know that their world is like, it's like a simulation. It's like the Lego world in the Lego movie. It's a video game. So when characters in the in-game world have some level of understanding of this fourth wall world and that their world is fictional, they can start achieving what are called the walking ways, which are paths to transcendence in some way or another. Kirkbride often alludes to lucid dreams when talking about the walking ways, and I think that's a great comparison. Lucid dreams are dreams where you know that you're dreaming, and you have some power over them because you understand that they're not real. Video games are like dreams because 1, they're not real, and 2, because they're the manifestation of desire. You know, we play them because they're fun. Well, I guess not all dreams are fun, but you get what I'm saying. So with these walking ways, characters in the Elder Scrolls universe end up with this power over it because they understand that it's not real, very much like a lucid dream. In Morrowind, Dagoth-Ur and his whole Sixth House following are built around this comparison of the in-game universe to a dream. At times it seems like Dagoth-Ur may actually believe that the world around him is literally his dream, which is a classic notion in skepticism. So I think the idea behind Dagoth-Ur as an antagonist might be that he misunderstands the nature of the Elder Scrolls universe being fictional as that he's in a perpetual state of lucid dreaming. Thus, in his mind, the in-game world, the wheel, everything isn't real, it's all just manifestations of his subconscious, which would explain his selfishness. Maybe he believes that every other character, and we the players, are all just figments of his imagination, part of his dream, but that's not how the Dwemer viewed the nature of their fictional world. The Dwemer attempted to use them to further their ambitions, mainly tonal manipulation. You know, it never occurred to me prior to this video, but I actually think Kirkbride's inspiration for the walking ways is what we in our world call science. Many people nowadays view science as a different thing than religion, but the founders of it would find that notion extremely confusing. You see, a lot of modern scientific thought starts with Galileo, who was a big fan of the intelligent design argument for the existence of God. In a nutshell, the argument is that certain things about our world seem planned, or just unlikely to be pure coincidence. The existence of life and consciousness is a good example. So if parts of our world are designed, then there must be a designer. Before Galileo, the world's greatest philosophers and theologians generally tried to understand God by asking why he does what he does, but Galileo approached it differently because of the intelligent design argument. He spent a lot of time dwelling on all this, and as a result, he made a key change to how he approached attempting to understand God, and this change altered our world forever. So if God designed our world, then he's like an artist, right? And in trying to understand an artist's intent behind a painting of theirs, and they're not around for you to just ask them, you look at the painting, right? You look for symbolism, brush technique, and things like that. In other words, you don't ask why they painted it a certain way, you ask how they painted it the way they did. So, maybe the best way to understand God isn't to ask why he does what he does, it's to study his design, aka the world, and attempts to understand how it works. How does rain fall from the sky? How does water stay in the straw when I plug the hole? How did the sun and moon appear and disappear? These are the kinds of questions Galileo started asking in his new attempts to understand God. And sure enough, other great thinkers like Newton, Kepler, and Leibniz followed Galileo in this new approach to understanding God, and they made huge strides in our understanding of how our world works as a result. Hundreds of years later, we call this understanding of our world science, and we use it to shape the world to our benefit with things like medicine, transportation, of course video games, and so on. And that's what the walking ways do in Elder Scrolls. NPCs bend their world to their wills through these various understandings of it being planned. They use their understanding of their world's design to their advantage, like we use science. And yes, I think this is a big part of the inspiration behind the Dwemer having this very science-y quality, because they are like scientists, or at least try to be. For the time being, you only really need to have a good understanding of the Sixth Walking Way, but I'll cover some of the others as they come up. So the Sixth Walking Way, the scarab that transforms into the new man. So this is the final step along what I refer to as the Path of the Godhead, which is achieving the second, fifth, and sixth walking ways in that order. So it starts with the Psijic Endeavor, then Kim, then the scarab that transforms into the new man. So you don't need to have an adept understanding of the first two to understand the Dwemer, but you should know the results of them. When someone achieves the Psijic Endeavor, they gain the ability to enter an abbreviated state of developer mode, and can make certain changes within the game. And many that achieve this one choose to create pocket realms, which are worlds within the Elder Scrolls world, little wheels within the wheel. This again toys with that layered worlds theory I was talking about. By understanding how their world is designed, they gain the ability to design their own little worlds within that one. Now let's talk about Kim. So the pronunciation of this one's often debated because over the years different developers have claimed different things. I forget who it was, someone said it was Chim as in chimney, but I recently found out that Kirkbride actually said no, it is Kim, that person's wrong. So because this video is about Kirkbride, kinda, I decided to go with the way he wants it pronounced, so Kim. So when someone achieves Kim, they become omnibenevolent, which means they love all things within the game because they understand that it is a game, and a really fun game too. Yeah, the example I used to explain this in the Walking Ways video was, I think it was the Sith. I used, like, Darth Vader and Darth Sidious, so they're antagonists, right? But you don't hate them when you're watching those films, because you understand they're not real. In other words, you love them for what they are, characters in a fictional world. So when someone achieves Kim, you know, they understand that. They look at, you know, characters like Ankano, for instance, and they love him for what he is, a fictional character. So yeah, that's kind of how this skepticism can lead to omnibenevolence, because they realize there's no reason to hate anyone when this world is fictional, it's for entertainment. So once one's achieved those two, they can attempt the sixth walking way. For this one, you need the wheel. In the hole at the center, there's something Vivek calls the secret triangular gate, which you have to look at sideways. And that would look like this, a boundless eye enclosing a regular eye, because in the middle, you'd be able to do flips or whatever without ever seeing an end to that eye, because there is no end. But the secret triangular gate would look like a regular eye within the boundless eye. As Vivek describes it, this is the secret tower within the tower. So once we're looking at this, we have the focus hard enough to get the interior eye to become a hole in the wheel, and that's the way out. Go through there to exit the wheel. Once that journey is complete, they'll see this, an Elder Scrolls fan playing one of the games in the fourth wall fictional world. After observing this for a bit, they'll start to fully understand the reality of their universe. It's a game, it exists to entertain, and we, the Godheads, choose to play. It's something we look forward to because a lot of the time that world is more fun than our world. So upon realizing all this, the walker will become a fan as well, and choose to go back to the wheel, because that's where the fun is. I mean, if we could choose to play the game from inside, we would, right? So that's the sixth walking way, and those that achieve it are called amaranths. This particular walking way is especially important for this video because it's the key to understanding the Dwemer. Now we need to take a look at another Kirkbride post. From my notes on the Dwemer, which may or may not help with what you're trying to accomplish here, just remember that these are 1x Deb's view of the things mentioned. They were unfathomable citizens of an inexplicable culture. Of all the races of Tamriel, the Dwemer, Deep Folk, or Dwarves are the weirdest. The Khajiit might have 24 different forms dictated by a magical, biological connection with Tamriel's moons, and the Argonians no doubt enjoy, at least psychologically, the most alien sentience on the planet, but the Dwemer are still weirder. Why? It's simple, really. Elves in popular fantasy literature have always been ciphers for humans, almost always of that special breed known as paragons on the decline. They are not the other, as lizard people and cat people must be, but rather the another, that which has qualities similar enough to humans that we can relate to it, but also possessed of a certain cultural outlook, religious tradition, or scientific method, so skewed that the relationship is strained almost to the breaking point. In Lord of the Rings, the aspect of the another was immortality. In Tamriel, and specifically the dwarves, that aspect is what I can only call heroic abrogation of everything, a complete and utter refusal to accept what everyone else experiences as the real. That's why the Dwemer are the weirdest race in Tamriel, and frankly, also the scariest. They looked like us, they sometimes acted like us, but when you really put them under the magnifying glass, you see nothing but vessels that house an intelligence and value system that is by all accounts beyond human comprehension. Dwarves were the ultimate Bartlebys of the universe. Whenever it asked something of them, they simply would rather not. Let me take this a step further and say dwarves regularly practiced the perception of a causal effects. Dwarves knew that phenomena, that which can be perceived by the senses, and noumena, that which is the thing itself, were both illusions, with the second one just being more clever. Dwarves could divide by zero. There isn't even a word to describe the dwarven view on divinity. They were atheists on the world where gods exist. They are Tamriel's biggest mystery, and there should be no ends to their enigma. Stories written by them should read as communiques between an X and Y axis that is tired of plainer love poetry. Personal accounts of their wars with the Chimer should seem like revelations written in computer syntax. A Numidium isn't a giant robot to them, but God's encyclopedia of amnesia, or their automated hypnagogic transgression. Yeah, I know, sometimes even I worry. MK. So, wow, a lot to digest there. Imagine how brutal that was for me to read. Yeah, but let's break it down into key themes. Yeah, so what does Kirkbride mean by heroic abrogation of everything? Well, I believe somewhere along the line, the Dwemer higher-ups learned of the reality of their existence as characters in a fictional world. Perhaps one of them saw the wheel in meditation, or they heard an account of it from someone else in Tamriel that had. However, due to their limited perspective on the subject, they took a very negative view of this reality. They were like, we're just characters that were created for someone else's amusement? The greater truth to our universe is that we're on this shiny gray spinning wheel? And that is fitting, because that's how most people in our world that have that extreme materialist mindset that the Dwemer have tend to respond to any notions of skepticism. Yeah, and they just hate this idea that the world we're in isn't the most real world. It makes them feel demeaned. So what did the Dwemer higher-ups decide to do about this? Well, I believe this is where the grand plan that would define the Dwemer's existence from this point on was made, which was to escape the wheel. Yeah, that's right, all their technology, everything they achieved, it was all part of this effort to escape. This was their grand plan. From this point on, they spent the rest of their existence trying to use the Walking Ways, Elder Scrolls, and who knows what else to escape the fictional world of Elder Scrolls and reach the most real world. But little did they know that was never really possible. The best any NPC can actually do is reach the fictional Fourth Wall world, which is still part of Kirkbride's fiction, along with their very desire to reach it. They're not capable of having desires, they're characters in the game. They quote-unquote wanted to escape because Kirkbride and his buddies thought that'd be a neat idea for a race in the games, and it is. So, heroic abrogation of everything is the Dwemer's refusal to take part in what they were created for, their refusal to exist for the amusement of someone else as characters in the game, which they saw as heroic, but in my opinion was really just kinda greedy. And how does that make them the ultimate Bartleby's, as Kirkbride put it? Well, he's referencing a famous short story by Herman Melville called Bartleby the Scrivener. In this story, a Wall Street lawyer hires a copyist named Bartleby to work for him. At first, he's a terrific employee, but eventually, he starts to just refuse to work. When given an assignment, he just responds, "I would prefer not to." This behavior gets worse and worse until Bartleby just refuses to do anything. He just sits in his chair doing absolutely nothing, and whenever someone tries to snap him out of it, he simply replies, "I'd prefer not to." He won't get up, won't eat, or anything until he just dies. So the Dwemer are the ultimate Bartleby's of Elder Scrolls because they refuse to do anything other than try to escape the Arbus. And how are the Dwemer atheists in the world with gods? Well, because they understand that the gods of their world are fictional, just like they are. They're in this fictional world within a more real world. So they approach theology with our world's theories and favor the atheist point of view. If you don't quite get it yet, if a Dwemer were to say they're an atheist, they're not saying they don't believe in their world's gods like Akatosh and Azura. They're saying they don't believe in the god that people worship in our world. Though other sources sometimes call them agnostic, and that's probably because some of them were agnostic. I think that we as fans sometimes have a habit of generalizing all the peoples of Elder Scrolls, but their beliefs aren't synonymous with their blood. And many sources do make a point to say that the Dwemer were not always united in their thinking. After all, the Rorken clan didn't agree with aligning with the Chimer. So when we're talking about the more astral aspects of Dwemer belief, we're mainly talking about the Tonal Architects. And that's a great segue into our next subject, the third walking way, tonal manipulation. So based on my findings for this video, I've decided to adjust my concept map for this one a little bit from what I presented in the past. The title I landed on for the whole third walking way category is tonal manipulation, though it's also sometimes called story rewriting, which is important to keep in mind. There are a few different forms of this that all involve altering reality within the Elder Scrolls world through sound. A notable example is the Thuum, which is used to speak certain effects into being. I think Yukudan sword singing likely falls under this category as well, and I hope to learn more about that in the ES6. We also have Tonal Architecture, which was the Dwemer's use of this walking way. So how does this work? Well, the Elder Scrolls universe is sometimes said to be a manifestation of sound, a song if you will. I think this concept was partly inspired by how Elder Scrolls was created, which was simply a group of developers bouncing ideas off each other. Though I also think it pertains to the little murmuring sound the disc makes when it spins, because that would explain Vivek's use of the word whirling to describe the philosophical study of the wheel. Whirling means to spin something in a circle, so Vivek's whirling school studies the whirling of the disc, the motion that causes their world to exist. So the Elder Scrolls universe is fictional. It was created by developers to be the setting for video games, which the Dwemer had some understanding of. Since it's fictional, it's impermanent, and therefore doesn't need to be the way that it is. It can be different. So how can it be changed? Well, if it was created with sound, then it can be altered with sound. Thus, where tonal manipulation comes in, sound can be used to alter the song, or perhaps jolt the disc a certain way to change the Elder Scrolls universe. Now let's dive further into how the Dwemer did this. Following the shattering of Lorkhan at Convention in the Dawn era, some Atata chose to become the Earthbones, which are Mundus's laws of nature. So they have the power to alter Mundus, but how can they do that in their non-sentient state? Well, even in their present state of being, they can respond to sound. So the Dwemer's best researchers managed to pinpoint a lot of specific tones needed to get a response from the Earthbones, and they named this practice Tonal Architecture. They made enormous strides with this in the First Era. They crafted special tools they would use to create useful tones and use them accordingly. It's often theorized that tonal architecture played a role in the Dwemer's pristine stonework and their technology, such as dynamo cores. Things got a lot more interesting when they discovered the heart of Lorkhan beneath Red Mountain. It's the epicenter of Lorkhan's divine power, so this presented the Dwemer with an opportunity. Could they use tonal architecture to harness the power of the heart? As it turned out, yes they could. It took years of research, but eventually, the greatest tonal architect, Kagrenac, crafted special tools he could use to redistribute the heart's divine power. His hammer Sunder, to apply the right tone to the heart to extract the amount of energy he wanted, his blade Keening, to harness the power once it's released, and his gauntlet Wraithguard to protect him from being destroyed by the process. He plans to use these tools to transfer the heart's divine power into a giant construct called Numidium. It's not clear if he ever actually got that far, but we know the Dwemer never deployed Numidium into battle, nor do we know what their plan was for this artificial god. But we do know that it didn't come to fruition, or at least not as they expected. Many legends also state that Kagrenac did something to the heart right before the Dwemer disappeared. So did he somehow use tonal architecture to cause the disappearance? Or perhaps that's not what he intended to do, but something went wrong with whatever his plan was. An important question that's always puzzled me about tonal manipulation is, does it work in Oblivion? The Earthbones are only the laws of nature in Mundus, so from that it seems like no. However, Oblivion is still part of the Wheel, it's in the Elder Scrolls universe, so it doesn't have to be the way it is, right? Well yeah, that seems to be right too, so what can we make of all this? Well, let's think about the origin of Oblivion in the lore. It's said that some Atata thought Lorkhan's plan was dumb, so they made their own realms according to their unique desires, which are now known as the Oblivion Planes. So my guess is that each plane of Oblivion has its own laws of nature according to the design of their respective Daedric princes. So the Dwemer tampering with the Earthbones in Mundus likely did not directly impact Oblivion, unless some of the princes decided they wanted it to. However, we can shout in Oblivion, which is what led me to this new framing of tonal manipulation, because I decided that the Fuim and tonal architecture are two different things, but both fall under tonal manipulation. The Dwemer's tonal architecture is contingent upon the Earthbones, so it only impacts their domain, Mundus. But the Fuim does not seem to be contingent upon the Earthbones. My theory is that the idea behind shouting is it's an in-game version of the same power the Elder Scrolls was created with. The original developers spoke Elder Scrolls into being, so there's some version of that in every layer of the Elder Scrolls universe. Though I will add that the Oblivion Planes do seem to have laws of nature, they're just not the same as Mundus's. They're whatever each prince decides they are. So in theory, tonal architecture might work in Oblivion, but the tones would be different there, heck they'd probably be different for every plane. However, I'm not sure what the laws of nature in Oblivion would be made from, because the Earthbones were once sentient beings, they were Atata. So were the ones in Oblivion once sentient beings as well? I don't know, I'm not sure that there's any source that'll tell me, so I'm still skeptical of how all this would work in Oblivion. Maybe we'll find out someday. So the Dwemer's tonal experiments don't seem to impact any realms outside of Mundus, and that could explain why Yagrim Bagarm was left behind when they disappeared, as he tells us he was in an outer realm at the time. That could refer to anything outside of Mundus, but the most reasonable guess is that he was in one of the Oblivion planes when the Dwemer disappeared. Furthermore, check out this line of Thalians. I know many things, I have studied things beyond the reach of most humans, traveled the Oblivion planes, seen things one should not see, I have met Daedra, and Dwemer, and everything in between, and I know enough to see a vampire where others would see a man. He seems to imply that he has met Dwemer in Oblivion, though that's not necessarily what this means. It seems the logical assumption given that he was just talking about Oblivion and having met Daedra. So it seems like any Dwemer that were in Oblivion at the time of the disappearance were not impacted by whatever caused it. So in my opinion, that makes it seem very likely that this cause does pertain to tonal architecture. Now let's talk more specifically about one of the ways the Dwemer tried to escape the wheel, Numidium. When they discovered the heart of Lorkhan beneath Red Mountain, they built this giant kaiju-sized animunculi with hopes of transferring the heart's divine power into it, thus creating an artificial god. But why? What was their intended purpose for Numidium? Well, now that we understand that their ultimate endgame was to escape the wheel, we can piece it together. One pretty famous Kirkbride work we're going to be discussing a lot from this point on is called Coda, which is an unofficial graphic novel that he and some of the devs he worked with put together. It's a very symbolic, almost comic book-like piece that tells a few crazy little stories. Some are part of a main arc, and others seem to just be for fun. It all takes place in this post-apocalyptic era of Elder Scrolls. During the 5th era, Numidium somehow resurfaced and laid waste to the planet Nirn. This event is referred to as landfall. But some residents of Nirn survived by settling on one of its moons, Masser, and their descendants still survive there in the main timeline of the story. Numidium has spent the years following landfall turning Nirn into a menage of steampunk gears, numbers, and other orderly things. This new Nirn is called the Wheels of Lull. The protagonist is a Dwemer named Jubal Lun Sul, a noble of House Sul, a family known for being salt merchants. Early on, Jubal is betrothed to the High Alma's daughter, who is like the princess of the story. However, her father demands that Jubal first prove his prowess by killing Numidium. Jubal somehow knows the secret to doing this, which seems to have been relayed to him in a flashback where this being called Servitor, or sometimes just Memory, tells him how to do it. And that's far from the only strange being in Coda. Throughout the story, these ghostly hands called the Digitals occasionally reach into the comic panels from outside to mess with things. And these Digitals are very important for us because they seem to be the masters of the fourth wall fictional world. So I'll use the Lego movie as the example again. Think of these Digitals as a fictional representation of Bethesda, like Will Ferrell's live-action character in the Lego movie. So Jubal is preparing to face Numidium, and he does something rather odd to do that. He amputates both his hands. How could that help him kill Numidium? We'll find out in a bit. After the operation, Jubal has a bachelor party. Since time is broken in Coda, as Kirkbride intends, gods from all over the Elder Scrolls timeline go to this party and have some interesting dialogues with Jubal. Eventually, Jubal leaves his own bachelor party to go face Numidium on Masser's surface. Numidium appears, but Jubal speaks to it instead of fighting it. For some reason, Numidium doesn't attack anyway. Though it refuses to speak back to Jubal, it just responds with these blank text bubbles. Jubal then explains why he cut his hands off by reciting a section of Sermon 11 of the 36 Sermons of Vivek. According to the codes of Mephala, there is no difference between the theorist and the terrorist. Even the most cherished desire disappears in their hands. This is why Mephala has black hands. Bring both of yours to every argument. The one-handed king finds no remedy. When you approach God, however, cut both of them off. God has no need of fury, and he is armored head to toe in terror. Jubal continues questioning Numidium until he finally gets a response out of it by simply asking why it destroyed everything, and it admits that its sole purpose, the reason it returns and destroys over and over, is simply to win. Which again is a little play on how all this is part of a video game franchise. Numidium wants to win the game, and that in its mind is destroying everything else, but the Elder Scrolls isn't that kind of game. So by removing his hands, Jubal was refusing to compete. He made it so Numidium killing him wouldn't really be winning, which compelled it to try to win another sort of battle, a dialogue battle, which it lost. Once Jubal gets the answers he's looking for from Numidium, he decapitates it with an empty speech balloon of his own. Then the Digitals emerge to announce, "No more wheel." Then the story closes out with the wedding scene. The final page is a coda symbol, which signifies the end of the story, as it would a song or another sort of fictional work. So this sheds a lot of light on what Kirkbride's vision was for Numidium during the development of Morrowind. When it returned to Nirn, it destroyed it with landfall and reformed the fragments into the ordered Wheels of Lull, and I believe this was always the Dwemer's intended purpose for Numidium. So how does that help with their grand plan of escaping the wheel? Well, I think Kirkbride's idea here is they were hoping to threaten to use Numidium to sabotage the game in an effort to force the Digitals to let them out of the wheel. The Dwemer were telling the Digitals, hey, you want to force us to exist as part of a game? Well, we'll just make our own god and use it to ruin your game, unless you let us out. This is further supported by one of Numidium's nicknames, the Anti-Creation. My guess is that really means anti-development. And I think this is all ingenious. Like, the thing with breaking the fourth wall is it's really hard to do originally, but Kirkbride does it in the most original way that I think I've ever heard of. I just love all this stuff. So now that we've covered the walking ways and the Dwemer's grand plan, let's pick up where we left off with the story of Dwemerith and Resdan. The Keimer and Dwemer didn't get along at first. This was largely because of their conflicting theological views. The Keimer were very pious worshippers of the good Daedra, and the Dwemer refused to worship any gods. So it just wasn't a match made in heaven, but they don't seem to have been violent towards each other, at least not on a large scale. Each group just kept to themselves and they avoided interacting with each other. That changed when a common enemy emerged in the form of the First Nordic Empire. Under the rule of King Vurage, Skyrim conquered large portions of northern Tamriel, including much of modern-day Morrowind. So two leaders emerged and formed an alliance to defeat the Nords, Indoril Nerevar of the Keimer and Dumak Dwarf King of the Dwemer. This alliance won. The Nordic forces were driven out of Morrowind around First Era year 416. Afterward, the Keimer and Dwemer formed a collective government called the First Council. However, the Rorken clan of the Dwemer refused to accept this permanent alliance with the Keimer. The lore about this doesn't get specific about why this was, so it ends up sort of implying that it was simply out of disdain for the Keimer's Daedra worship. But I don't think that's the truth. This is something that's going to come up again once we cover the Disappearance. So the Rorken clan refused to be part of this new arrangement, and according to legends, the Rorken chieftain threw his hammer, Volendrung, as far as he could, and told his people that they would settle wherever it landed. Though it's not known if this is meant literally or if he had some construct or magic to help him throw it, because it landed really far. It landed in the northern Alakir desert between where Sentinel and Sadakalam are now. They built the city of Volenfell there, and yes, they got this namesake because it's where Volendrung fell. Over time, the whole region became referred to as Volenfell, but when the Regatta Yakudans arrived and took over, it gradually changed into Hammerfell. That part of the story is thoroughly documented in lore. Multiple PGEs have passages all about it. You might recognize the name Volendrung from the games. In Skyrim and Oblivion, it's the warhammer that you're awarded for completing Malakav's Daedra quests. Though it's actually appeared in every single one of the 5 main series games. However, there is some doubt that they are all the same weapon. A source called What is Volendrung shed some light on all this. A second hammer called Volendrung, this time a Daedric artifact belonging to the Daedric Prince Malakath, exists in records nearly as old as the Dwemer version. Malakath's relic echoes the Dwemer name, and for this reason, many assume that it is the same legendary weapon. But why would the god of curses associate himself with an object forged by enemies? To make a mockery of Dwemer work? To take something the Dwemer treasured and use it as an instrument against them? A rather subversive and indirect action, unbecoming of Malakath's historically straightforward mentality. Ingarin's Daedric Armory speculates on the hammer's magical features. The text cites several Mages Guild papers, claiming the hammer empowers its wielder and drains the strength of struck foes, very much in line with Malakathian design. There is little doubt that the relic described could be tied to the god of curses. What is in doubt is whether it was named by mortals or by Malakath himself, and whether the Rorken clan wielded the same hammer in centuries past. What is Volendrung? Tamriel may never know. So it's possible that there are 2 different Volendrungs. One might suggest that Malakath copied the Dwemer version, or perhaps stole it from them to mock them, but the source claims that would be out of character for him. I do question that characterization though, because he does have an association with revenge. In the SO, he even refers to himself as the Daedric Prince of Vengeance. So I find the idea that he stole Volendrung from the Rorken clan or made his own out of mockery totally in line with his character. We should consider other possibilities though. Let's assume that it is the same hammer but Malakath didn't steal it. How else could it have changed hands? Perhaps the claims that Volendrung originated from the Dwemer are actually wrong, and the weapon's original crafter is actually Malakath. Thus, in his eyes, he didn't adopt a weapon of theirs, he took back one that was rightfully his. After all, in Skyrim it doesn't sharpen with dwarven metal, it sharpens with ebony. So how could the Dwemer have gotten it from him? Maybe they somehow managed to steal it from his Oblivion plane, the Ash Pit. Why would they have done that? The obvious answer that pops into my head is they might have wanted to use it in tonal experiments. One of Kagrenac's tools is Sunder, a hammer, so maybe they thought studying Volendrung's unique properties could lead them to discoveries in tonal architecture, and what they learned played a role in crafting Sunder. Another possibility is maybe he gave it to a Dwemer as a reward for something, like how he gives it to us for completing his quests. It's unlikely that it was the Rorquin chieftain since they end up as enemies later, so perhaps it was passed down to him, and when it landed in the Alakir Desert, Malakath took the opportunity to reclaim it. We do know that the princes do that since they have the artifacts to give to the new player character in every game. Also, King Dumac is sometimes referred to as Dumac Dwarfork, and one source even calls him Dumalakath, suggesting that the relationship between the Dwemer, Malakath, and his orcs goes back further than the First Council. So yeah, I think it's very possible that Malakath gave Volendrung to a Dwemer, and that's how they originally ended up with it. Another theory to consider is that maybe the hammer was indeed crafted by the Dwemer, but when it landed in the Alakir Desert, some Malakath worshippers came across it before the Rorquin arrived, and they used it as a ritual offering to Malakath, which is how he ended up with it. There would have been orcs and goblins nearby, so it's very possible. We should discuss the latter a bit further. Some sources mention that Malakath invaded Volenfell with a goblin army after the Rorquin moved in, and they supposedly won, driving the Rorquin into refuge. But no one knows what Malakath's motive was for this, but perhaps it was over ownership of Volendrung. Maybe one way or another it ended up in his possession after it landed in the Alakir Desert and he took a liking to it. After all, what is Volendrung points out that it is the kind of weapon he would like. So yeah, maybe his goblin followers found Volendrung out in the Alakir Desert and offered it to him and he was like, man, this thing is awesome. But then the Rorquin clan arrived and demanded it back, and he said, finders keepers, if you didn't want to lose it, you shouldn't have thrown it across the continent and expected no one to take it. And if Volendrung really was of major cultural importance to the Rorquin, they may have attacked Malakath's followers to pressure him into giving it back, which is when he responded with his invasion through the Goblin Gate. I like this theory, but based on Dumac's monikers of Dwarfork and Dumalakath, it seems like the history between Malakath and the Dwemer goes back a bit further than this. That certainly doesn't make this theory wrong, but this invasion of huge goblins doesn't seem to have been the start of the story here. Now let's examine each game's Volendrung to get some insight based on their designs and enchantments. To get it in Arena, you track it via rumors until an innkeeper sends you to a radiant dungeon where you'll find a map leading to Volendrung. The Codex Scientia has this to say about the weapon. The Hammer of Might Volendrung is said to have been created by the dwarves of the now abandoned clan of Rorquin, hundreds of years before they disappeared from the world of Tamriel. It has the ability to grant health to its wielder, but it is best known for the paralyzing and strength-leeching effects it has when cast at an enemy. Like the dwarves who created it, Volendrung is prone to disappearing suddenly, resurfacing sometimes in days, sometimes in eons. That's very interesting, isn't it? Volendrung's like the sword of Godric Gryffindor from Harry Potter, though the Codex does say similar things about other artifacts, but not all of them. But really we know from finding them in each of the games that they have ways of changing hands, and I think that there are knockoffs in play too. In this case, I'm not sure, but yeah, I think, like, say, the Staff of Magnus in Morrowind, I do not believe that's the same Staff of Magnus from Skyrim. And in this case, I'm not sure the idea that it literally goes poof and is gone has remained true in modern games. My guess is no. Its enchantment was Cause Paralysis 100% chance on touch for 10 seconds, damage health 30 points, plus 1 point per level, drain strength 25 points for 15 rounds per level, target recovers at 1 point per round. And its original design from Arena was a gold hammer with a bird on it and a red gem in the middle. Daggerfall's Volendrung very closely resembles that original design, but these prongs were added and every version after has them too. The biggest thing of note from this game is that during Malakath's quest to get it, it's referred to as the Volendrung. That could be taken to mean that there are multiple Volendrungs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Its enchantments in this game are Paralysis and Vampiric Touch. In Morrowind, Volendrung is found in the chest beside Yagra Magarn, so perhaps he found the Hammer of Might during his travels looking for his people. It actually has no enchantment in this game, and the design was very notably different from the first two games. It lost the golden coloring, and the shape became more of this horizontal rhombus, and there's no red gem in the middle. Oblivion's design is quite similar to this, but the shaft and pommel are a little different. Its enchantment is drain health 5 points for 20 seconds and paralyze 3 seconds, and in this game it's once again awarded by Malakath for completing his quest. Now Skyrim is where it gets most interesting. It's still awarded by Malakath, but this design is completely new. It seems inspired by past ones, but the shape is a much fuller box, and it has this layered pattern on it surrounded by a glowing red spot, which looks like it might depict an eye. Its enchantment is absorbing 50 points of stamina per hit. However, I think the biggest clue from Skyrim is that Volendrung sharpens with ebony, not dwarven metal. In Elder Scrolls, ebony is said to be the fossilized blood of gods, particularly Lorkhan. Large amounts of it are found in the vicinity of Red Mountain, so I think it's possible that the big deposits like Gloombound Mine and Raven Rock Mine are what's left of bloody chunks that fell off the heart as it flew through the sky from Adamantine Tower. So could this Volendrung have been crafted from Lorkhan's blood? I have some additional thoughts branching from this idea. Could this design be depicting the eye within the infinite eye from the Sixth Walking Way, the one Lorkhan intentionally failed so he could go on to create Mundus, and again at convention to split himself into fragments? That would go nicely with either the Dwemer or Malakath having crafted the weapon. If the Dwemer made it, then perhaps it's meant to depict their end goal of escaping the wheel. That is what the Sixth Walking Way allows one to do, at least in a fictional sense, though the Dwemer were way off on how to achieve this one. So what I think might be going on with Volendrung is the Dwemer may be trying to use the First Walking Way to further their understanding of the Sixth, along with making some bizarre attempts to achieve it. This one, the Prolix Towers, involves making physical representations of these astral concepts involved with the walking ways in Mundus to make it so the walkers don't have to envision them. The most notable example is the Creation Towers. They're supposed to look like the Eye, but there's also things like the College of Winterhold, which is supposed to resemble the original Xbox's disc reader, well at least the one that would have been most common. So the purpose of the First Walking Way is to use these physical representations to further your understanding of these astral concepts via some hybrid of meditation and reasoning, which can help with the other walking ways. So I think Volendrung might be the Dwemer's attempts to depict the Secret Tower within the Boundless One in order to study it with hopes of achieving the Sixth Walking Way. My holdup with this is why a weapon. It's more common to use buildings to do this, and the Dwemer were master craftsmen. I guess this might be another nod to how the Dwemer were just all wrong in their approach to escape the wheel. They wanted to force their way out, but it can't be done that way. It's done through love of the game, not resentment for one's role in it. The Dwemer never understood that, and I think part of the problem was they always interpreted everything very literally due to their very materialistic mindset. And branching off of that, I wonder if their idea for Volendrung was to literally use it to break through the outer shell of the Elder Scrolls universe by hitting it with this hammer. After all, I could totally see how that logic could work in their heads. They're figuring that this magic warhammer that they forged with Lorkhan's blood might be able to breach the firmament that encloses Mundus, because Lorkhan is to Mundus as Daedric princes are to Nairplanes. They both are the realms themselves and bodily manifestations that we see them as within the realms. Additionally, this ominous red eye makes me think this might be a fragment of Lorkhan, like the heart and Chezerine's are. So maybe the Dwemer managed to locate one of these fragments and built it into Volendrung because they figured they could use Lorkhan to break Lorkhan. The problem with this, though, is that Mundus is only the innermost layer of the wheel, so if they want to escape the whole wheel, well, they're gonna have to figure something else out to breach the other firmaments. But I mean, they could just be figuring that's a problem for another day. This at least gets them closer to where they want to go. So that's all good stuff, assuming that the Dwemer did indeed craft Volendrung, but how could all this Volendrung being made from parts of Lorkhan stuff fit with Malakath being its crafter? Well, he was once Trinimac before Boethia mantled him, and he was Auriel's right-hand man during the Elnathay Wars. In some legends, it's actually him that slays Lorkhan, so perhaps he made a hammer from some of the blood as a trophy, or as a reminder of his greatest failure, that he couldn't obey Auriel's order since Lorkhan cannot truly be slain. We might say that's the curse of the God of Curses. The last little thought I have about Volendrung is really a loose thought, but I decided to throw it in here because why not? I wonder if the shape of the actual hammerhead is supposed to sort of look like an original Xbox. It kinda does, and it would fit with everything else, so let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I want to take a second to tell you about Fallout for Hope. Fallout for Hope is a charity initiative that raises money for various causes. I'm currently fundraising for the Alzheimer's Association, which does great work for people that suffer from this terrible disease. So if you're interested in getting involved, supporting a campaign, or simply finding out more, see the link in the description. In addition to Hammerfell, the Dwemer also expanded into Skyrim. However, sources are inconsistent on the exact details of when this happened. Archenfam's ping caught in Dragon's Teeth has this to say about the subject. My findings suggest that in the decades following the establishment of peace between the Chimer and Dwemer, dwarves of Clan Kragan began to seek new holdings beyond Resdon. Following the path laid out by the exiled Clan Rorken during their exodus, the dwarves of Clan Kragan reached what we now consider Skyrim and first established their presence in the region with the founding of Archenfams. It's unclear precisely what appealed so much to the Kragan explorers that it was worth settling among the hostile Nords, but in spite of regular attacks by the warlike men, their city flourished. So much so that it encouraged other clans to expand their own holdings to the west. This loose alliance of clans effectively established a pocket empire of 4 city-states that were considered unassailable. Not that the Nord stopped trying. This source suggests that Clan Kragan was the first Dwemer clan to settle Skyrim, and that they did so after the Rorken clan settled Hammerfell, which was around First Era year 420. However, when we consider other sources, along with things we know about Skyrim's Dwemer population, that just doesn't add up. There's an antiquity item in ESO called Ancient Extraction Tool, and we should take a look at the descriptions of it. This looks like a mining tool, from somewhere around the First Era year 240 if I had to guess. Quite sophisticated for its time, but maybe that's due to the size. This looks like a personal apparatus, not used for large-scale ore extraction, certainly. I don't think this is just any mining tool. Look at the engravings. Amalian can correct me if I'm wrong, but these look like Dwemer markings to me. This thing is unique. There's a magical component to it, or at least there used to be. Any ideas? Oh, considering where it was found and how specific the apparatus seems to be, my guess is that it was used to extract Aetherium. Robbafar dwarves would probably have experimented with devices like this before moving on to heavier machinery. So this seems to suggest that the Dwemer had established Robbafar in Skyrim by First Era year 240, which is almost 200 years before the Rorken clan left Dresden. So Clan Kragan may have not been the first Dwemer in Skyrim, or maybe they got there a lot sooner than some sources suggest. Robbafar being among the first Dwemer settlements in Skyrim does make some sense when we consider the locational proximity to Morrowind. This also gets complicated when we consider that they must have been well established in Skyrim when the Snow Elves came to them as refugees. Ysgramor's campaign against the Snow Elves began in the late Malefic era. So did it take hundreds of years to go from the retaking of Starfall to the Snow Elves ending up with the Dwemer? That doesn't seem logical. Based on everything I know, I believe the Dwemer were well established in Skyrim in the late Malefic era. So what drew them there to begin with? Well, if we assume that Robbafar was indeed one of the first settlements, there is an obvious answer. Robbafar was one of the main places the Dwemer discovered and mined a material known as Aetherium. Little is known about what Aetherium actually is, but the name suggests it has something to do with Aetherius, the realm that the gods of the Elder Scrolls universe came from, and that the realms of Oblivion and Mundus are enclosed within. It's not unheard of for matter from Aetherius to end up on Nirn. The Ayleids were known to collect shards of meteoric glass, which are bits of Aetherius that fall to Nirn as shooting stars. I'll also point out that the Eye of Magnus is often theorized to come from Aetherius, and it's a very similar shade of blue to Aetherium. So eventually, these 4 city-states of Arkenthans, Robbafar, Befar-Zel, and Mizulft ended up going to war for control over the very Aetherium forge they had formed the alliance to create. And since they were busy fighting each other, the Nordic High King at the time, Gelir, took the opportunity to conquer them. Sort of like what the Thalmor are doing to the Imperials and Stormcloaks. The Dwemer retook their holdings eventually, but the sources don't provide any details about how they did this. We do know that they divided the Aetherium crest we find in Skyrim into 4 pieces and sealed this elevator to the forge. Perhaps the remnants of the 4 city-states all agreed to do so because they realized the forge made them vulnerable by dividing them, or perhaps the remnants united under one government that ultimately made that decision. I find the former more likely because, well, if there's one Dwemer government, then why abandon the forge? If they're already united, then why not keep it? So what is Aetherium, and what were the Dwemer's intentions for it? The book, The Aetherium Wars, is our logical starting point. An alliance of 4 cities, led by Arkenthams, the greatest research center in the Southern Reach, was formed to oversee its extraction, processing, and study, and a new Aetherium forge constructed to smelt it under precisely controlled conditions. If the inscriptions I discovered are to be believed, the results were nothing short of spectacular. The items produced by the forge were artifacts of immense power, imbued from the moment of their creation with powerful enchantments. The important thing to note here is these items crafted with the forge come with the enchantments. Why would that be of interest to the Dwemer? Well, it took years of research to get the enchantments right for tonal tools, such as Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard. Maybe the limitations of natural enchantments in Mundus make it hard or even impossible to create tools like that, so they hoped these default enchantments with Aetherium could bypass those limitations. That makes sense when we consider that this material seems to come from outside of Mundus, so it may be exempt from certain rules in Mundus. Also, Keening's blade does look like it might be made of Aetherium. It sharpens with dwarven metal, but that blade clearly isn't made of that. So perhaps the Dwemer were able to craft Keening, a blade that can absorb energy from the heart, by experimenting with Aetherium until they got it right. Another thing I think we should note is that the Aetherium forge is located so deep underground that it seems to be right above what I suppose we'll call Nirn's mantle. So part of what's entailed in these precise conditions for working Aetherium is you need access to some extreme heat, magma, to even smelt it. There isn't really any source material that says magma has any lore connotations, but some logical guesses assuming it does are that it could pertain to Lorkhan, the Earth Bones, or maybe the Khajiit goddess Nirni. I think the fact that Nirn seems to have a mantle like our planet Earth's is a detail we should remember for future videos, because I could see there being more to this than meets the eye. Moving on, something I find particularly interesting about how the Dwemer were approached in Skyrim is that there are barely any named dwarves in the lore this game added. Morrowind had Kagrenac, Bafuand, Dumak, Yagrim, Radak, and one or two more, but Skyrim barely said anything about the Dwemer that actually inhabited the ruins we explore in that game. The one exception comes from Dwemer Inquiries Volume 2. The author, Thelway Galeen, found this passage in Erkenfand and translated it. Risen by order, cousin of privilege, Quillic of Shizaline privileged duties, clan home building, Hogan Kultura tradition, hailed world shaper. Offers translation, Therese granted cousin Quillic of untranslatable privilege with duties for family homebuilding, Hogan Kultura, tradition to Father Mundus Shaper. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of Dwemer worship of Mundus, but I do not agree. My translation of this passage suggests that a respected Dwemer by the name of Quillic was promoted to a civic position, probably tonal architect. The latter half of the fragment suggests that Quillic's position requires him to build in a specific style. The term Hogan Kultura has thus far eluded me, but I believe it may be the name of such a style. It's possible there were several styles, differing in their construction principles and typical structures. So was this Quillic one of the major leaders of the Skyrim Dwemer? Perhaps he was one of the architects who researched Aetherium. I have no idea what Hogan Kultura could be beyond what the author said, but I'm sure a lot of you are thinking that the word Shezaline sounds a lot like Shezarine, which is a mortal reincarnation of one of Lorkhan's fragments. This would fit the context we've established, however the word Shezarine comes from the Alessian Empire, which was established in the First Era year 242. Though I suppose it's possible that the Dwemer picked this term up from the Nords when they moved in and eventually adopted their own version of it. So we might interpret risen by order cousin of privilege Quillic of Shezaline privileged duties as meaning that Quillic was a Shezarine. And once he was identified as a Shezarine, he was tasked with these special duties related to that. However, we could also read this as the term Shizaline being used to refer to the Mundus since it is Lorkhan. In that context, these duties would likely pertain to the study of Mundus, which fits a bit nicer with the overarching theory we're building here. However, the next volume of Dwemer Inquiries offers us a bit more of a clue about Quillic. I have found in a small number of ruins reference to a geological anomaly or place known as Volendrung Deen. This is intriguing because the term not only appears in a few tablet fragments, but also very specifically on ornate metal frames in the deepest reaches of the Alfdand, Erkenfand, and Mazinchalev strongholds of Skyrim. I have yet to decipher the meaning of these elaborate carvings, but consider it highly strange that they occur in the deepest part of each of these ruins. Risen by order cousin of privilege Quillic of Shezaline privileged duties, clan home building Hogan Kultura, tradition to hailed world shaper. The most reasonable translation of Volendrung Deen I have managed to decipher is Blackest Kingdom Reaches, but I cannot imagine what that means. I suspect there may be some pattern I am failing to notice. This creeping doubt has haunted my career in recent years, and I have begun to doubt if I will unravel some grand secret of the dwarves in my lifetime, though it lies just under my nose or under my feet. We of course know that this Volendrung Deen is Blackreach, one of the most fascinating ruins in the whole series. And the author mentions it alongside that passage about Quillic again, seemingly implying they found these carvings mentioning each of these things nearby to each other. So Quillic may have lived in Blackreach, and from that I have a strong guess as to what his role was to the Dwemer. So we were thinking that these unique duties of his might pertain to being a Shezarine or studying Mundus. Then there's this mysterious Hogan Kultura phrase, followed by tradition to hailed world shaper. What did the Dwemer do specifically in Blackreach that might be described as studying Mundus? They read Elder Scrolls down there in Mizark. So I think that Quillic's Shezaline privileged duties were reading and deciphering Elder Scrolls. Yeah, I think he was essentially the Dwemer's equivalent of a moth priest. Now, who is this hailed world shaper? The obvious answer is Lorkhan, but I don't think that's right because the Dwemer wouldn't hail him since he's responsible for their existence in Mundus. But who was involved in the shaping of Mundus that they might hail? Magnus. He was the architect of it, and when he realized he was getting less powerful there, he escaped. Exactly what the Dwemer sought to do. We know they didn't worship any gods, but they very well might have respected Magnus for escaping. So is Hogan Kultura the study of Mundus through the Elder Scrolls? That's possibly part of it, but I think there might be a bit more to it than that. Magnus literally flew through the sky, broke through the firmament creating the sun, then I suppose he flew through 2 Oblivion planes as well, creating holes in those shells too, and exited in Aetherius. I think the Dwemer wanted to follow in Magnus's footsteps literally, and the main thing they wanted to learn from studying the Elder Scrolls was how they could build a spaceship to take them to the edge of Mundus so they could escape just as Magnus did. Spaceships do come up in lore. Kirkbride has essentially confirmed that Adamantine Tower was originally a spaceship. Also in Coda, people have settled on Masser. Furthermore, going off Adamantine Tower, it makes a lot of sense that the Dwemer would be especially interested in this specific Elder Scroll we find down here, Dragon. This is the one that we use to see into the past during the main questline, where we see Feldir the Old use it to cast Alduin the Drift in Time. But would that have worked with just any Elder Scroll, or was it being this specific one key to whatever he was doing? It does seem convenient that it just happens to be the Dragon Scroll, because dragons often pertain to time in this universe. And we do know that specific Elder Scrolls can be used for specific things, since in the Dawnguard questline it has to be the Sun, Blood, and Dragon Scrolls to get the whole prophecy. So why might the Dwemer have been especially interested in the Dragon Scroll? Well, I'm wondering if they might have thought they could use it to see into the past just like we do, to see Adamantine Tower as a spaceship, so they could get direct insight on how it was constructed and how it worked and all that. They couldn't study the actual tower because at this point a lot of changes had been made to it by the Dureni, and who knows if they'd even let the Dwemer in to look at it. There's one more clue to break down for this space mission theory. The tower with the Elder Scroll reader is called Mazark. It didn't occur to me until after I wrote the rest of this, but I think that name might be inspired by Noah's Ark. In that story, Noah built a massive ship, the Ark, so that his family and some animals could survive the Great Flood. The Ark shepherded them from the old world into the new. So I think Bethesda may have named this tower Mazark as a subtle hint for its purpose, which is for the Dwemer to figure out how they could construct an Ark of their own to carry them off the wheel. Now that we've covered Quolic and the space mission theory, let's speculate about what Blackreach actually is. How did these massive caverns underneath Skyrim come to exist? Thanks to dialogue with Gwendis in the SO, we know that vampires settled down here seemingly before the Dwemer, which means they didn't dig these expanses out, they were already here and the Dwemer tunneled into them. And based on the info from ESO, it doesn't sound like the vampires dug them out either. They settled down here after they were created. So how did Blackreach come to be? Well, if it's been here since considerably long before the Dwemer, then it likely dates back to the Elnathay. Sure, the Atmorans did a lot of tunneling of their own, but none of their ruins connect to Blackreach, so we're likely dealing with Elnathay and their Atata masters. Let's start with the why. Why would they carve out these massive caverns underneath Skyrim that span nearly the whole province? It's probably a war tactic. It allowed one of the sides of the War of Manifest Metaphors to move troops around the province discreetly. There's a line from the Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition Skyrim that we should read. Looking at virtually any vista in Skyrim, one is looking at the remains of a battlefield. The Great Adric cataclysms that brought Tamriel into existence in primeval times seems to have spent most of their fury in this northern land. So according to this source, Skyrim was the main battlefield of the Elnathay Wars. And this is a source that I think about a lot because a lot of my theories do tie back to the Elnathay Wars, and this confirms that I'm on the right track. A lot of the secret lore of Skyrim does tie back to that time period. Another clue that points to Blackreach being part of all this is there is some ebony down here, 6 veins to the exact, which is a considerable amount. So a god must have bled down here at some point. Maybe whichever side Blackreach was being used against found out about it and set up an ambush. So now let's cover the how. How might these caverns have been dug out? I have 2 ideas for this. First, there's an artifact down here during ESO called the Dark Heart, which pertains to the Void. So they may have moved this Dark Heart around down here to suck matter into the Void, thus creating the caverns. Second, this might be where Volfurjol comes in. This unique dragon can be encountered in Blackreach by shouting at the massive orb above the Silent City, which the game guide calls Volfurjol's Gong. Notice the huge glowing orb floating above the Silent City at the center of Blackreach. Hit this distant target with your unrelenting force shout and you'll summon the dragon Volfurjol, who will soar out of his hidden lair to rain fire upon the city before setting down on the southern road. So what's a dragon doing down here of all places? Well, I wonder if the commanding Atata used dragons to carve out the caverns of Blackreach with their fire breath. And the gong could be dragon fire that the Dwemer somehow contained in this sphere of theirs, maybe with tonal architecture. I certainly think the Dwemer would have been capable of that kind of thing, especially considering that the Spellbreaker shield of theirs is able to repel magic, so is, containing dragon fire really that big a stretch? I don't think so. So maybe one day they intentionally provoked Volfurjol just to catch some fire. But why does shouting at it summon him? Well, I'm not sure that there is a magical reason for this. The fact that it has to be the unrelenting force shout and how it's dangling from a thread here makes me think the original idea may have actually been for the shout to send it flying and even knock it down, and then would fall to the ground and explode, making a huge amount of noise, which Volfriol would simply hear from his lair and go investigate. We should also discuss the large amount of Aetherium in Blackreach. So here's my issue with the theory that Aetherium is meteoric glass like Ayleid stones. If that's the case, then how is it that it's found mostly underground? The sources are very firm on the Dwemer mining Aetherium, and it seems like this light blue material found abundantly in Blackreach is supposed to be it in its ore state. After all, one of the entrances to Blackreach is Ralbafar, which was supposedly the biggest Aetherium mine. So how did all this Aetherium end up underneath Skyrim? Well, the presence of ebony down here gives me an idea. Perhaps Aetherium is another material formed from the blood of gods like ebony, and the reason the Dwemer found so much of it down here is that the god or gods whose blood this is were slain down here. So what gods could that have been? Well, the two main gods associated with the dark heart that's found down here during ESO besides Lorkhan are Azura and Namira, so perhaps one of them was guarding it. But there's one more clue that ties everything we've discussed in this chapter together very nicely. It's a line about the Battle of Red Mountain in 5 Songs of King Wulfharth. Nerevar carried Keening, a dagger made of the sound of the shadow of the moons. In what sense is Keening made of that? Well, Nirn's 2 moons, Master and Secunda, are sometimes associated with Azura. After all, she is the Prince of Dusk and Dawn. Furthermore, her plane of oblivion is called Moonshadow, and of course she has strong ties to Nerevar. So yeah, I believe that Keening being made of the sound of the shadow of the moons does refer to Azura, and as we discussed earlier, I think the actual blade is made of Aetherium. Thus, I believe that Aetherium somehow comes from Azura, maybe it's her blood, or based on that line about it being made of sound somehow, we might guess that Azura used tonal manipulation to create Aetherium. Also, look at the material that lines Azura's star and forms the structures inside of it. Looks a lot like Aetherium, doesn't it? So yeah, I think we're on the right track here. This next part is very speculative, but all this can make sense of something I've always wondered about Azura. Her relationship with Lorkhan is consistently depicted as a positive one, but if that's the case, then why didn't she become an Aedra and partake in the making of Mundus? Well, if we consider that Aetherium could be her blood, then we might guess that she was originally an Aedra, but was slain in Blackreach during the War of Manifest Metaphors and was banished to oblivion. That's a decent theory, but I have one I like a little better. Maybe her becoming a Daedric prince was all part of Lorkhan's plan. Think about this, Aetherium is often theorized to pertain to Aetherius somehow, right? But it's found in Mundus, and Oblivion separates those two realms. So maybe they somehow used Azura's plane, Moonshadow, as a bridge between Aetherius and Mundus to somehow make it possible to create Aetherium under Skyrim. That's an intriguing thought, however most theorists, including me, think that Oblivion has kind of an upper and lower level, like this, because it's more consistent with how Vivek describes it. He kind of says that the wheel has these 8 spokes, so, we have to divide it into 8s, and for there to be 16 Daedric planes, there kind of have to be these 2 levels. Though I am a little skeptical of this because remember, to them, in the actual in-game world, these things are all actually spherical, it's not flat like it is in the wheel drawing. So, in theory, there could just be 16 all on the same level, but I feel like it makes sense to assume that the fourth wall fictional world wheel is a flat representation of, the spheres. So, yeah, I am gonna lean towards that there are these 2 levels. And if that's the case, then for this Azura theory to work, then they probably would have needed whichever Daedric prince's plane is directly above or beneath Azura's to be on board too. And they might have been, who's to say Lorkhan didn't have more allies? A few of the modern Daedric princes are confirmed to not be original, like Sheogorath, Malakath, and Meridia. So perhaps one of the ones that's since been replaced was an ally of Lorkhan's, though I also think someone like Molag Bal could fit the bill here. So I know I just laid a lot on you, so let's summarize. The caverns that are now known as Blackreach were likely created by one of the sides of the War of Manifest Metaphors to move troops throughout Skyrim unnoticed. My theory as to what the Dwemer were doing down here beyond just mining Aetherium is they were transcribing Elder Scrolls, with a particular interest in the Dragon Scroll we find down here, because they hoped the knowledge gained from it would help them fulfill their grand plan of escaping the Wheel. Some specific things they may have been looking for were how exactly Adamantine Tower was built and how Magnus broke through the firmament. And lastly, Aetherium likely originates from Azura in some way. She may have been slain down here, or perhaps she created it with tonal manipulation. So now that we've covered the Dwemer's history in Hammerfell and Skyrim, we should pick up where we left off with their alliance with the Chimer and Resdawn, because we're getting close to when they disappeared. The alliance went very well at first, but things changed when the Dwemer found something under Red Mountain, the Heart of Lorkhan. So part of the monomyth must be true, because the Heart of the World really did exist, and it really was, where it was supposed to be, east of Adamantine Tower. And this artifact of immense divine power was exactly what the Dwemer needed to escape the world that was created to satisfy this heart, and the world that its bearer came from. So the Dwemer studied it under Kagrenac's leadership. There are some claims that the Tonal Architects kept this a secret from King Dumac and the rest of the Dwemer. Whether or not that's true, we don't know. We do know that the major plan they ended up pursuing with the heart was Numidium, and as we theorized, their intentions for this anti-creation were probably to threaten to use it to ruin the game unless the digitals freed them from the wheel. However, this took a turn when the Chimer learned what Kagrenac was up to. Somehow Voron of House Dagoth discovered that the Dwemer had found the heart and were constructing Numidium. Maybe he had spies in Red Mountain. Based on bits and pieces from different accounts of these events, it seems like Voron was playing every side he could in the rising conflict. Perhaps he was planning to get the heart for himself the whole time. So Kagrenac's shenanigans got back to Nerevar, and he feared for the worst because, well, there aren't too many good things people do with giant robots. So Nerevar approached his friend and ally Dumac about Voron's accusations, and he denied they were true. But we know that the Chimer did march in Red Mountain. In Vivek's version of the story, Nerevar spoke to Azura after his meeting with Dumac, and she told him that the accusations were true. So one way or another, Nerevar declared war on the Dwemer. His generals, Amalexia, Vivek, and Sophasil, managed to draw the bulk of the Dwemer forces out into the open, and most of the battle was fought in the slopes of Red Mountain. Nerevar and Voron Dagoth used that as a distraction to infiltrate the fortress in pursuit of Kagrenac and the Heart. They reached the Heart Chamber, but Dumac was waiting for them. Perhaps he knew of Kagrenac's plans all along, or maybe he was just protecting his people. Regardless, a fierce duel ensued between Nerevar and Dumac. The exact details are different in every account, but we know they both died of their wounds at some point. But what's important for us is what happened to the Heart. At some point in all this, someone struck the Heart with Kagrenac's tools, and every Dwemer in Mundus vanished instantly. In most versions of the story, it is Kagrenac that strikes the Heart, and I think that's what makes the most sense. In the aftermath of the battle, Voron used the tools to transfer some of the Heart's power into himself, which is when he became Dagoth-Ur. But Nerevar's generals slew him and secured the tools, though by binding himself to the Heart, he established some sort of respawn point, so he kept coming back throughout history until he was defeated once and for all by the Nerevarine during the events of Morrowind. Vivek, Amalexia, and Sophasil swore an oath to Azura that they would safeguard Kagrenac's tools to ensure they'd never be used again. However, at some point they returned to Red Mountain, applied the tools to the Heart, and made themselves into a trio of gods that are commonly referred to as the Tribunal, breaking their oath to Azura. She was furious with them, so she transformed the entire Chimer race into the Dunmer and vowed that one day Nerevar would be reincarnated to punish them for their treachery. Now it's time to dive into the groundbreaking theories I've got for you. The first major question we should answer about the Dwemer is their origin. How'd they end up in Morrowind before the Valathi, and how were they genetically related to the Chimer and/or Dunmer? Well, there's some cut content from ESO called Secret Origin of the Dwemer that I believe holds the answer. It was written as 4 notes the player would have found during some sort of dungeon delve, but it got cut before release. Fortunately for us, data miners were able to dig it up from the game files. Gods, I have seen the visions you have given me, I have embraced it wholly, I have followed it here to the Cave of Revelations, I have given it the name Ziffendaz, it is the Dwemeris acronym for Time Wizard. They laughed at me, well no more, now I have proof. It all makes perfect sense. Everything in here is brass. Brass is the color of time. It is the same way forwards and backwards. When you transpose it into Aldmeris, it's spelled Zafagan Afaz, Ziffendaz. The truth will not be denied. Ziffendaz, brass time wizard, I can hear the music right now. The notes spell out the mystery. The Free Alliance leaders are just puppets. Molag Bal was a distraction designed to divert our attention from the truth. I just need to find some crystals. It's all here, all the proof I need. The Dwemer were time visitors from the future. These ruins are impenetrable because they have not been built yet. So according to these rantings, the Dwemer came from the future, and that makes a lot of sense. Their technology was so far beyond anything that any other culture was capable of because they were originally from a time where this kind of thing was commonplace. This also explains how they can have blood ties to the Chimer and Dunmer despite not being Valathi. They're not the Chimer and Dunmer's ancestors, they're the Chimer and Dunmer's descendants. In all fairness, this is cut content, so how do we know we should take it seriously? Well, Kirkbride himself was asked about this, and here's how he responded. This is clearly one of them there shoulda hit delete type situations. He's saying that they should have deleted this from the game files. That's quite a response. So I think this is indeed the first step to solving the Elder Scrolls' biggest mystery, and ZeniMax let it slip. Furthermore, time travel like this is very well grounded in both official sources and Kirkbride's unofficial works. There are clues to point to Pelennor Whitestrake being a cyborg from the future, such as the Song of Pelennor Volume 1 saying that his left hand was made of killing light, and the second volume literally saying, and then kind granted Perif another symbol, a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves, whose facets could unsector and form into a man whose every angle could cut her jailers and a name, Pelin El, which is the Star-Made Knight, and he was arrayed in armor from the future time. Also, Kirkbride has alluded to Pelennor being some sort of cyborg in a few posts. Additionally, one of Kirkbride's more famous unofficial stories is Kinmoon, where he tells the story of a robot that was sent backward in time from the 9th era. So yeah, this kind of thing is well grounded in this series, and the Dwemer being time travelers can also help us make sense of some other mysteries about them. For instance, why no one knows exactly what dwarven metal is made of. And the metal used in all so far discovered dwarven relics is entirely unique to their culture. No other race has replicated whatever process was used to create dwarven metal, although it can be easily mistaken for bronze, and in fact many forgers of dwarven materials use bronze to create their fake replicas. It is most definitely a distinct type of metal of its own. I have personally seen metallurgists attempt to combine several different types of steel and common and rare ores in order to imitate dwarven metal's exclusive properties, but the only method that has been successful is to melt down existing dwarven metallic scraps and start over from there. The reason though blacksmiths can figure it out is because, some material or method that's needed to make it doesn't exist yet. Imagine if a medieval blacksmith tried to make the metal that iPhones are made of, it simply wouldn't be possible. Whatever secret tonal methods or materials that go into making dwarven metal were only known and perhaps even comprehensible to the Dwemer. This can also shed some light on their technology, like dynamo cores for instance. These apparatuses play a role in powering many Dwemer machines such as animunculi, but how exactly do they work? Well, there's a few different kinds, but they all contain a power source, often a soul gem, and the middle part spins. I think these things might be renewable energy. My guess is that some kind of push comes from the power source, which is, the soul gem, and that forces the outer shell to spin, and that somehow creates what we understand as steam power. Though I'm skeptical of whether or not it's, actual literal steam, because, for there to be steam doesn't there have to be water somewhere. So maybe it's not really steam, but, it looks like steam to us. So yeah, I'm not sure how exactly it works, so that's my guess for the gist. But assuming I'm right about the spinning being caused by some sort of push and pull like magnets, well that's a way that the power source can be used without actually draining it, so it lasts forever. We know from the games that soul energy is not infinite, which is why the Dwemer didn't simply pop soul gems in their animunculi to power them, because that would run out eventually. However, many of them do have soul gems in addition to dynamo cores. So why might that be? Well, Centurions and Spiders, while machines, are not magically inert, they have spells that cost magicka to cast. So my guess is the extra soul gems are for that, because there's no technological way around paying the price for spells. Very much like enchantments or staves, we have to charge them up with soul gems. But spheres and ballistas are magically inert, they have no spells and no base magicka, and yet sometimes they have soul gems, so how do we explain that? Well, ballistas can't actually drop dynamo cores, so they may actually use the soul gems as their power source, but spheres can drop both. So my only guess is that maybe Bethesda originally meant to give them a spell, but changed plans at some point. So the big question we need to ask here is, why did the Dwemer travel to the past? I think it's all about in their grand plan to escape the wheel. We have no idea what the timeline they came from was like, but we know that in this one they chose to start their civilization on Vardenfell, particularly on Red Mountain itself. It seems an odd choice to build a civilization on the slopes of a volcano, doesn't it? Why would the Dwemer choose to live here? Well, if they came from the future, then the likely answer is they knew what they would find within, the heart of Lorkhan. Think about when you start a new playthrough of Skyrim. You tend to have a plan, right? You go into it knowing that Breezeholm is the cheapest house, and you can buy it pretty early on. And you know some leveling exploits like clearing out mines, making stuff with the ore, enchanting it, then selling it. Because you've played before, you go into it knowing exactly how to set yourself up for success, and I think that's what the Dwemer were doing. I think they realized that they were fictional characters on this wheel as part of a game in their original timeline, then they started looking for ways to escape and figured the heart could be exactly what they needed. But for some reason it was inaccessible to them, perhaps it had been destroyed, or maybe it was in the hands of a more powerful faction. We know that the Nords tried to get their hands on it when they found out it was in the possession of the Dwemer in this timeline, so perhaps in that timeline the Nords had it. Regardless, I believe the Dwemer found the way to send their entire race back in time so they could find the heart themselves, and research it with the end goal of finding a way to escape the wheel. There are some loading screens in Skyrim that prompts the question of why do animunculi still guard Dwemer ruins? What the Dwarven Sphere lacks in strength, it makes up for in speed and mobility, as it patrols the halls of the Dwemer ruins it still protects. Of all the automatons left behind by the ancient Dwemer, the Dwarven Centurions are among the most technologically impressive, and deadly. They guard Dwemer ruins as if their masters still walk the halls. It's as if they're waiting for their creators to return, but I don't think that's quite right. I don't think they're waiting for the Dwemer that constructed them to come back from some other plane of existence. I think they're waiting for the Dunmer to become the Dwemer, as they did in the timeline their builders came from. This also gets interesting when we consider something that Dwemer Inquiries Volume 1 notes about the differences in layout of Dwemer ruins based on location. The author notes that the ruins on Vardenfell tend to have their important civic and operational chambers near the surface, while ruins in places like Skyrim tend to have things like that much deeper, and they speculate about why that might be. Geological makeup of the terrain almost certainly played a role, especially in a region like northern Skyrim, where the ground near the surface is very rocky and often frozen, as opposed to the volcanic substratum common in Vardenfell or the ubiquitous aquifers found in Hammerfell. It's possible that Dwarven architects in the north were not able to excavate larger structures until reaching more pliable strata. What the author suggests here may be right, but I do want to suggest something in addition to this. Maybe the early parts of the Vardenfell ruins have the important stuff because the Dwemer wanted the Dunmer to settle into their structures after their departure, so that they would evolve into the new Dwemer, thus repeating the cycle. But they wanted to keep the Nords and other local peoples of where they had cities out of them, so they made sure to keep all the important stuff in Skyrim's ruins deep within because they didn't want the Nords getting to it. I'm not sold on this, but I think it's an interesting idea. Now we must solve the greatest mystery in Elder Scrolls, the Dwemer's disappearance. Let's go over the details of what exactly went down. Many sources consistently say that the entire Dwemer race disappeared in an instant during the Battle of Red Mountain. But we know that the exception to that is those that were out of range of the Earthbones when this happened, such as Yagrim Magarn. Many sources add that in this split second in which they vanished, something happened to the heart. Let's read a few of these sources. We'll start with the Vex account. There, Nerevar the Chimer King met Dumak the Dwarf King, and they both collapsed from grievous wounds and draining magics. With Dumak fallen, and threatened by Dagofur and others, Kagrenac turned his tools upon the heart, and Nerevar said he saw Kagrenac and all his Dwemer companions at once disappear from the world. In that instant, Dwemer everywhere disappeared without a trace. That's probably the most mainstream account of what happened. Nerevar and Dumak dueled nearly to death, then Kagrenac did something to the heart with his tools, and poof, the Dwemer everywhere disappeared. Now let's read a slightly different account. This is the one the Tribunal Temple stuck to during its reign. There, Nerevar met Dumak and the Dwarf King, and they both fell from grievous wounds. Dagofur slew Kagrenac and took the tools the Dwemer used to tap the power of the heart. He went to his dying lord Nerevar and asked him what to do with these tools, and Nerevar summoned Azura again, and she showed them how to use the tools to separate the power of the heart from the Dwemer people. And on the fields, the Tribunal and their armies watched as the Dwemer turned into dust all around them, as their stolen immortality was taken away. So in this one, it's Vorin Dagoth that actually is the one to make the Dwemer disappear with the heart, but Azura was the puppet master. Also in this one, the Dwemer don't vanish, their physical bodies disintegrate, and there actually is a Dwemer ruin in Morrowind called Bams Mshend, where there are actually little piles of ashes along with some Dwemer weapons and armor scattered around as if they were once dwarves that simply combusted in an instant. This is the city that the new Mournhold was built on top of, along with the original Mournhold. But this is the only Dwemer ruin where we find anything like this, so did all the Dwemer really collapse into dust, or did these Dwemer suffer a different fate than the rest of their race? I believe the latter is our answer, because in the base game, Baladas Demnavani makes a clear point that the Dwemer didn't leave any remains behind, and this is a pretty important dialogue in the base game, so I doubt Bethesda would have made a mistake with it. As the Dwemer left no corpses or traces of conflict behind, I believe that generations of ritualistic anti-creations resulted in their immediate but foreseen removal from the Mundus. So let's talk about some possibilities as to what happened in Bams Mshend. The Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition Morrowind offers an interesting tidbit about Mournhold. It is reputed to be built over the ruins of a vast dwarven city, although the current inhabitants vigorously deny this. Interesting, why would the Dunmer be so adamant about denying the existence of Bams Mshend? It's widely known that the modern city of Mournhold is built on top of the original Valathi Mournhold that was destroyed by Amalexia and Sophasil's fabled battle with Dagon, so why deny the existence of a Dwemer city down there as well? Perhaps it's to hide what really happens to its inhabitants. Maybe when the Alliance fell apart just before the Battle of Red Mountain, the Chimer sacked Bamzimshend. The problem with this is the ash piles are placed as if the Dwemer simply disintegrated in an instant. Some of them are in chairs, and others are placed as if they were on guard duty. That wouldn't be the case if they had fallen in battle. Well, maybe it wasn't a battle exactly. Even before becoming gods, the Tribunal were powerful beings, so perhaps Almalexia and Sophisil were down here in southern Resdom when the Alliance fell through and received orders from Nerevar to bring troops to Red Mountain. But they were concerned that the Dwemer of Bamzimshend may attack Mournhold when they were gone, so Sophisil went down there and unleashed the massive fire spell that killed all the Dwemer. Then they departed for Red Mountain. And after all this was said and done, the newly formed Tribunal Temple added that turned into dust part of their version of the Red Mountain story, so if anyone ever made it into Bamzimshend, they'd assume that's why there's ashes down there. That's one possibility, but here's another. During the Tribunal Temple questline, the Nerevarine meets a Dwemer ghost down here named Radok. His job in life was to make weapons, and one of the things he was working on was this mini construct that looks a lot like a mini Numidium. So maybe before the Dwemer's mass disappearance, Radok was experimenting with tonal architecture as well, and something went wrong, resulting in a huge fire explosion. Those are the two main possibilities as to what happened in Bamzimshend that I'm gonna stick to. As for which one is right, I'm leaning more on the second one, but let me know what you think in the comments. But I definitely don't think that the Dwemer's bodies faded into dust when they disappeared on the mass scale during the Battle of Red Mountain, because Bamzimshend is the only place in Elder Scrolls where we find these little ash piles. Regardless of what exact Red Mountain story we're following, every source on this subject consistently claims that the mass disappearance of the whole Dwemer race happened in an instant. They were there 1 second and gone the next. However, in Dwarves Volume 3, Calsamo notes that there is no actual material evidence for that. For instance, while we can say with absolute certainty that the disappearance of the entire Dwarven race happened very suddenly, only the laziest of junior scholars would say that this event happened in the same day or even the same hour. There is simply no proof to dispute the theory that perhaps the dwarves disappeared from Tamriel gradually over the course of several years, or indeed several decades. This paragraph is pretty strange. He's nitpicking for no reason. He's essentially saying that since there's no empirical evidence that the Dwemer didn't gradually disappear over several years, we might as well believe that too. But whether Calsamo likes it or not, the sources being consistent that it did happen in an instant does count for something, and it's literally every source besides this weird little rant of his that says it. PGE 1st edition Hammerfell. Sadly, these same ruins offer no clues as to the mysterious disappearance of the dwarves from Tamriel, which was everywhere the same, circa 1st Era, year 700. And the 3rd edition makes a point to note that the exiled Rorken clan was included in this. PGE 3rd edition Hammerfell. The House Rorken's severing of ties with the Dwemer of Resdon did not protect them from the results of the War of the First Council. Like the other Dwemer, the Rorken seem to have vanished suddenly from Hammerfell, leaving their wonders to the open sky. So yeah, I think Calsamo's just being annoying for no reason, as he often is. Though an important, unique circumstance we should go over is that of Yagrum Begarn, who to our knowledge is the last living Dwemer. Why didn't he vanish with the rest of his people, and what does he know about all this? I cannot say what happened. I was not there to observe. I was in an outer realm at the time, and when I came back, my people were gone. I left Red Mountain, wandering Tamriel for years, searching our deserted colonies, looking for a survivor or an explanation. Then, a long time ago, I returned to Red Mountain, still looking for answers. Instead, I found Corpus disease, and I have been here ever since. I have theories if you were interested. So as we discussed already, he wasn't affected by the Dwemer's disappearance because he was in an outer realm at the time, likely an Oblivion plane. This reinforces the notion that the Earthbones only have influence in Mundus, thus any Dwemer that were in Oblivion, Aetherius, or the Void were not impacted by whatever happens to the heart. So there could be more survivors that we might meet in future games, who knows? I think it would be really cool to meet someone from the Rorken clan in the S6. But perhaps the most important perspective on the Dwemer's disappearance is Vivek's. He was present at the Battle of Red Mountain, and he knows quite a lot about the astral, fourth wall-breaking concepts of the Elder Scrolls universe through his study of the Walking Ways. So what does he have to say? I have no idea what happened to the Dwemer. I have no sense of them in the timeless divine world outside of mortal time, and in fact, if I did believe they existed, I would be in no hurry to make contact with them. They may, with some justice, hold the Dwemer race responsible for their fate. My intuition is that they are gone forever, and that is perfectly fine with me. So this self-made god that knows a whole lot and has no reason to lie at this point has no clue what happened. It's not clear what he means by divine world outside of mortal time. My two guesses are 1, that tapping into the heart made it so we can sense Aetherius, and 2, that he's referring to the meditative state of comprehending the wheel, seeing the fourth wall fictional world. Either way, he's saying he doesn't sense a large population of Dwemer anywhere, but he doesn't seem super confident that he would be able to sense them if they were hiding somewhere. Probably because there are things they could do to hide from him. We know that the gods of Elder Scrolls are not omniscient, and the Dwemer had thorough knowledge of some of the walking ways, so they may have concocted some way to hide from Vivek's gaze. However, I don't believe they did. I believe they are indeed gone, and have no existence within the wheel, besides survivors like Yagrum Bagarn. So let's dive into some theories for the Dwemer's disappearance. So I do think it was indeed Kagrenac that struck the heart with the tools and caused the disappearance. This quote from Yagrum Bagarn offers us some more insight on these tools. This is what he says when asked about mythopoeic enchantments. I'm not sure I can explain. In his research for the secrets of immortality, Kagrenac sought to control supernatural forces that you might call divine. This artifact, called Wraithguard, was one of the tools he created for this purpose. Some believe his tampering with such forces was profane and terribly dangerous. You know the Dwemer disappeared. His use of these tools may have been responsible. So what does mythopoeic mean? The Merriam-Webster definition is creating or tending to create myth or myths. It's an adjective used to describe fictional mythologies like the Elder Scrolls. So these mythopoeic enchantments on Kagrenac's tools are enchantments that allow Kagrenac to alter the Elder Scrolls mythology, at least to some extent. And whatever Kagrenac did to the heart, it impacted all Dwemer within range. And with that in mind, we should discuss something called the Calling. Here's a passage about it in the publisher's notes in Ancient Tales of the Dwemer Part 6, Kimar Venedium. Another aspect of this legend that scholars like myself find interesting is the mention of the Calling. In this legend, and in others, there is a suggestion that the Dwemer race as a whole had some sort of silent and magical communication. There are records of the Sigic Order which suggest they too shared a secret. Whatever the case, there are no documented spells of calling. The Cyrodiil historian Borgasilis Malier first proposed this as a solution to the disappearance of the Dwemer. He theorized that in the First Era, year 668, the Dwemer enclaves were called together by one of their powerful philosopher-sorcerers, Kagrenac in some documents, to embark on a great journey, one of such sublime profundity that they abandoned all their cities and lands to join the quest to foreign climes as an entire culture. So this calling could explain how Kagrenac might have applied whatever he did to the heart to every Dwemer in Mundus at once. A possibility I'll propose here is maybe upon observing the duel between Nerevar and Dumac, Kagrenac realized something. They were two people who had come to care for each other and bridged their civilizations as a result, but now because of what he had done, they were forced to fight each other to the death. So maybe observing this cruel twist of fate caused Kagrenac to realize the true meaning of their existence within the Wheel, within the fictional world of Elder Scrolls. It's not a prison, it's a paradise where imagination runs free, where you can be an adventurer questing to your heart's content, meeting interesting characters as you go, and finding really cool stuff while seeing gorgeous sights along the way. And in realizing this, Kagrenac achieved Kim, and called all his people together to enlighten them about this error in their thinking, and all the Dwemer achieved the Sixth Walking Way together, thus leaving the Wheel. But where did they go from there? Well, the thing about NPCs understanding the reality of their fictional existence, at least as much as actually possible, is that once they know what reality outside the Wheel actually is, well, why would anyone choose to live there when they could live in the Wheel? The whole reason we play video games, watch TV shows, and enjoy other fiction is it's usually a lot more fun and interesting than our world. So perhaps the Dwemer finally escaped, then realized that life is better within the Wheel, so they went back but to another Kalpa where they could get a fresh start and enjoy the game as Lorcan, Bethesda, and the Digitals intended. So this theory is a nice thought, and I guess it's the one that gives the Dwemer the happiest ending of everything I've got for you, but no, I don't think this is the right one. Yeah, there's other ones that just have many more clues going for them. So moving on, what might Kagrenac have done, or at least been trying to do, when he applied the tools to the heart? Well, another name for the third walking way that's used in some obscure sources is story rewriting, which is fitting because that's essentially what you're doing by manipulating the Earthbones. You're using the laws of nature to change how the story of Mundus is written. Sort of like the book in the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water that came out in 2015. That Burgerbeard character used that book to alter the story of SpongeBob to make it so he had the Krabby Patty secret formula. So did Kagrenac simply write his people out of the story, like when SpongeBob erases Doodlebob? Yeah, I wasn't going to reference SpongeBob without something from the OG seasons, that'd just be blasphemous. We're honoring Stephen Hillenburg properly. So maybe Kagrenac simply erased the Dwemer when he realized they were going to lose the Battle of Red Mountain. They had traveled to what was the ancient past to buy time to figure out how to escape the Wheel, but even with their far superior technology, they were about to lose this battle to the Chimer, their ancestors, who were essentially savages to them. So he could have just sent all the Dwemer back in time again, but ultimately, why assume they wouldn't just lose to the Chimer in that timeline too? Maybe this wasn't even their first attempt. Could be they were stuck in a cycle of writing themselves into the story in the Malefic era, trying to use the heart to escape the wheel, failing to keep it a secret, then losing the Battle of Red Mountain over and over. So maybe Kagrenac decided to end the cycle by using story rewriting to erase all the Dwemer from Mundus because in his mind not existing was better than having to exist within the wheel. That's definitely a better theory than the first one, but we should also consider the possibility that regardless of what Kagrenac was trying to do, something went wrong, because Yagrim Bagarn suggests that in a few dialogues. Lord Kagrenac, the foremost arcane philosopher and magecrafter of my era, devised tools to shape mythopoeic forces, intending to transcend the limits of Dwemer mortality. However, in reviewing his formulae, some logicians argued that side effects were unpredictable, and errors might be catastrophic. I think Kagrenac might have succeeded in granting our race eternal life, with unforeseen consequences, such as wholesale displacement to an outer realm, or he may have erred and utterly destroyed our race. By refreshing my memory with divine metaphysics, I believe I can explain. The Dwemer were not unified in their thinking. Kagrenac and his tonal architects, among them Befuand, Mizanj, believed they could improve the Dwemer race. Others argued that the attempt would be too great a risk. The war with Nerevar and the Dwemer may have led Kagrenac to carry out his experiments prematurely. Although this book argues that nothing disastrous could result, the disappearance of my race argues otherwise. Balada's Demnavani suggests this too. Yes, with the help of Hanging Gardens, I can read some of this book. It is the essence of Kagrenac's theories on how one might create a new god through the obedience of the Yelnathay and using the sacred tones on the heart of Lorkhan. Whatever its value to scholars, his theories did not appear to work quite as he intended. Yes, I can now translate these books. The first one is Befuand Bazanch's refutation of a popular theory from Nerevar's time. A few tones of Dwemer believed that using the power of Lorkhan's heart was an unjustifiable risk. The Egg of Time contains Befuand's arguments against this idea, many of which are quite compelling. The next book, Divine Metaphysics, is an explanation of how the Dwemer tried to make a new god, and Numidium, using Kagrenac's tools and the sacred tones on Lorkhan's heart. So what could have gone wrong? My first idea is that Azura may have intervened at the moment Kagrenac struck the heart to change the outcome of whatever he was trying to get the Earthbones to do to erasing the Dwemer. We know that they had a very jaded history with Azura, which makes sense when we consider her background. She's often said to be one of Lorkhan's siblings, and has a favorable view of him along with his creations like mortality. So how would someone like that feel about the Dwemer's outright refusal to give Mundus a chance and dedication of their whole existence to escaping it using her brother's severed heart? They probably wouldn't like it. Furthermore, we know that she backed Nerevar more than anyone else involved in the Battle of Red Mountain, which fits with all this because the Dwemer and Almcivi both did things that she'd view as disrespecting the heart. Ancient Tales of the Dwemer Part 11, Azura and the Box, tells a story about the Dwemer's relationship with Azura. And the publisher's notes say this story definitely did originate from the Dwemer. In this tale, a Dwemer scientist named Nickelbar has his Chimer friend Afinic summon Azura so he can ask her what's inside the closed box he has. So he's testing whether or not the gods of Elder Scrolls are omniscient, all-knowing. And the answer is no, they are not. In this version of the story, she guesses that a red flower petal is in the box, but really there's nothing in it. The publisher's notes say that in the earliest known version of this story, it contains some kind of spherical device that transforms into a flat square after Azura guesses to try and trick her. But what's really interesting is the final paragraph of the publisher's notes. Whatever the true nature of the gods, and how right or wrong the Dwemer were about them, this tale might explain why the Dwarves vanished from the face of Tamriel. Though Nickelbar and his kind may not have intended to mock the Aedra and Daedra, their skepticism certainly offended the Divine Orders. So they suspect that there might be truth to this story, and that this test of the Dwemers may have given Azura, and maybe some other gods too, motive to end them. Perhaps when Kagrenac struck the heart, he was trying to do something like erase the Chimer from existence, but Azura interfered somehow, and the request the Earthbones ended up getting was erase the Dwemer. I could see it, and we know that Azura was lurking around during all these proceedings because we know the Tribunal really did swear an oath to her. Furthermore, there is a dialogue where Yagrim blames the gods for his people's disappearance. Once I was a master crafter in the service of Lord Kagrenac, chief architect of the Great Second Empire freeholds, and the greatest enchanter of his time. I could not match the genius of Lord Kagrenac, but what he could envision, I and my colleagues could build. All of that is gone forever. I still retain my cunning, but my hands and eyes fail me, and my memories have long faded. My only consolation is each day to mock the gods who destroyed my race, and condemned me to this bleak existence. So maybe Azura is responsible for the Dwemer's disappearance. This isn't my favorite theory, but I think it's plausible. Now we're going to cover a pretty popular theory, and that's that the Dwemer were in some way absorbed into Numidium. Reddit user Laurel and Delasa provided a pretty good synopsis of this in the TES lore subreddit in a post called Numidium Skin. What does it mean to be the skin of a god? For my definitions and interpretations of the significance of skin, I would say that the Dwemer inform Numidium's interactions with the environment. Their souls form a film of sentience around the divine metal of the monster, allowing it to reflect on its environment. However, as gods are not built for self-reflection, having a sentient skin does not confer any measure of that quality upon the Numidium. Symbolically, what this may represent in terms of the success or failure of the Dwemer is very open to interpretation, and I invite others to share their thoughts. I believe that it's a form of poetic justice for the arrogant and ambitious Dwemer. Yes, they have become part of a god and created a new reality, but they are only the most superficial veneer of the god, their biggest contribution being a conduit of interface between the god and the mundane world, a tool of the god, like an altar or relic. They are part of the god, their presence informs the god, but they have no control over the decisions of the god. Is Numidium well served to wear them as a shell? Talos is Talos to the people, sometimes Shor, or Shezar, but he is always himself. Kine may be Kinnereth, or Tava, or Khan, but she is still herself. But the Numidium is always that dwarven creation. Mortals will never see it as anything other than that. Well, maybe not all mortals. Jubal saw it differently, and perhaps that is why he was allowed to kill it. He was willing to look deeper and appreciate it for what it was, not what it appeared to be. Personally, I believe being the skin of Numidium represents a failure on the part of the Dwemer. The Dwemer wanted to be divine, to become their own dream, like the Altmer, just in a different way. What they ended up achieving, however, was a pale shadow of their goal. They became a perception of a god, and an element of that god's perception. But perhaps because they never knew love, they failed to actually become Numidium. The skin is not capable of feeling or knowing love/love, compassion, hate, anger, or fear. It is capable of sending and receiving signals of those things, but without the sentience underneath, its signals are meaningless and empty. This theory fits with some aspects of what we've established, like that the Dwemer's main error was refusing to know love. But the notable contradiction is I don't believe the Dwemer's main goal was to become divine, I think they wanted to escape. Though I do think that the core of this theory, that the Dwemer got absorbed into Numidium, has legs. After all, in Coda, Jubal does tell Numidium, you were the escape route, you are the disappearance of the dwarves. Furthermore, this can fit with what we've established about how tonal manipulation works. The Earthbones don't always get it 100% right, they're like genies, except they don't screw up on purpose to mock you like genies do, they do it accidentally. So perhaps Kagrenac was indeed trying to make his people divine when he struck the heart, and the Earthbones did just that by making them part of the god they had constructed. Another possibility I'll add here is maybe Numidium interfered and intentionally absorbed the Dwemer into itself. Their goal was to escape the wheel, but Coda says Numidium's goal was simply to win. It conquered Nirn and turned it into the Wheels of Lull because that's what it saw as winning Elder Scrolls. So maybe when Kagrenac started telling the Earthbones, make all Dwemer ... Numidium interjected and finished the sentence with part of me. Because in Numidium's mind, that's getting closer to winning, it's defeating the Dwemer. This is a very intriguing theory, but I have two problems with it. First, if that's what the Earthbones did to the Dwemer, then why didn't they do the same thing to the Tribunal? They used the tools to make themselves gods, but they didn't get sucked into Numidium. I guess maybe they were more specific with the request, like they said, alright Earthbones, we want you to extract divine energy from the heart of Lorkhan, which will then absorb into ourselves, thus becoming gods. And I suppose they'd have to put a sock in Numidium's mouth too. And you know, they could have, but I have another problem with this theory. If the Dwemer got fused with Numidium, wouldn't Vivek be able to sense them? They may not exist in the same form, but they exist in a form, right? I guess he wouldn't exactly have the reference point he'd need to know because he never actually saw Numidium until after the Dwemer were gone. To wrap this one up, I think this is a good theory, but it's not the best one to have for you. So what do I believe caused the Dwemer's disappearance, and where are they now? Well, I actually didn't finish reading you that section of Secret Dwemer Origins. The one that Kirkbride's response to was, this is clearly one of them there shoulda hit delete type situations. Let's finish it up now. It's all here, all the proof I need. The Dwemer were time visitors from the future. These ruins are impenetrable because they have not been built yet. They disappeared because something happens that caused them not to be born. But I have discovered it, and I will set time on the right course again. I will bring them back. Folks, what we've got here is a Back to the Future kind of situation. It's like when Marty McFly starts to fade during the dance because it's getting less likely that his parents will fall in love. Since the Dwemer came from the future, they inevitably changed the course of history, and somewhere along the line, something changed that caused their initial time travel not to happen in the future, which is why they went poof. But then why are their structures and influence on events still present? Let's start with the buildings. That line saying they're impenetrable because they haven't been built yet is curious. The thing is, Dwemer ruins aren't impenetrable, nor are they indestructible. Sure, the stonework is fantastic and these structures are tough, but we know from exploring that they can break. I think the author is just saying that Dwemer architecture is so remarkable because the technology used to create them came from the future in their own crazy, ambiguous way. But why didn't the buildings go poof with their creators? Well, we can attribute this to tonal architecture. They were made by altering reality, so I don't think it's crazy to assume that they'd remain afterward. Because in Elder Scrolls mythology, the material world is older than what mortals understand as time. What exactly this means is often debated by experts. Some argue that it means there was simply no forward progressing time prior to convention, which to be honest I think is pretty clearly false. When we read these myths, we see that they're clearly meant to form a chronological series of events. I think the idea here is that back in the Dawn era, the Atada had Mundus in developer mode most of the time. It's another one of those little fourth wall inspirations, but mortals understand this time as being in player mode. So perhaps since the Dwemer used tonal architecture to make their structures, they transcend player mode and thus mortal time. I guess we might interpret the third walking way as using sound to coax the earthbones into using the Psijic endeavor to alter the world in dev mode. Yeah, and on a little side note here, I think that those that achieve the Psijic endeavor can put themselves in, this abbreviated state of dev mode, while Mundus is in player mode. Another thing I'll toss in here branching from this is it could explain the hidden purpose of dwarven metal. If there's some secret involved with making it, then it must serve some purpose, because otherwise why not just use common metals like iron? An earlier paragraph of Secret Dwemer Origins stood out to me for this subject. It all makes perfect sense. Everything in here is brass. Brass is the color of time. It is the same way forwards and backwards. When you transpose it into Aldmeris, it's spelled Zafaganathes, Zifandaz. The author points out that this color is often associated with time, and that in the ancient Aldmeris language, it's a palindrome. So I wonder if the idea here is that the Dwemer used this metal because they thought it had some capacity to survive dragon breaks. I'll also point out that since Morrowind, armor sets made of this metal are always very closed. They cover a lot of the body compared to most suits. So maybe the Dwemer thought that draping themselves in this metal might shield them from any dragon breaks that could be caused by their altering of the past. It's an interesting thought, but regardless of whether or not it's right, well, it didn't work, did it? And if it is right, it raises another interesting question. Why did the Dwemer believe it might work? Did they have some research about this metal that made them believe that it might be able to survive dragon breaks? Who knows? In summary here, the Dwemer's structures, weapons, armor, and other physical crafts remaining after this paradox caused them to disappear is something we can't explain away. However, the Dwemer's influence on this Kalpa is harder to explain away. Characters remember the Dwemer, the Dunmer would still be Chimer if not for them, so why didn't any of that get undone by the Dwemer never having come back in time in the first place? To understand this, we need to talk a bit more about dragon breaks. Every once in a while, time breaks in Elder Scrolls, and these breaks are called dragon breaks. There doesn't seem to be one singular cause of them, but the Dwemer seem to have caused one by creating a paradox. When they happen, time has to fix itself, and the result doesn't always make sense in the end. Really, Kirkbride's intent with these was to make it so no individual player choices have to be canonized in sequels. The most famous dragon break is the Warp in the West, which made all the possible endings to Daggerfall's main questline canon at once. So yeah, it makes it so regardless of what choices you made in Daggerfall, you can still believe that's true in Morrowind, you know what I mean? So if all the choices in Daggerfall can be canon at once because of these dragon breaks, then I think it's totally feasible that the Dwemer's influence on this Kalpa could remain despite them never having come back in time. So the results of these dragon breaks can be catastrophic, just ask the Dwemer. Oh yeah, you can. And I think the Dwemer knew that this time travel of theirs could very well cause one, because having that fear explains a lot about them. I think that was the primary reason they built their cities underground and tried so hard to stay away from the other inhabitants of Tamriel. They knew they didn't exist in the timeline they came from, so any interaction between them and the peoples of the past is something that didn't happen in their original timeline. Thus it could change the future, which it eventually did. I also believe this is the real reason why the Rorken clan refused to accept the alliance with the Chimer. They knew it was a huge risk for altering the future. I mean, it's kind of a trope in time travel where you're not supposed to meet yourself or your ancestors, right? Well, that's just what the Dwemer did here. So the Rorken clan took off, hoping that if they weren't around, they might be spared by any dragon breaks the Alliance would cause, or that at the very least it wouldn't be their fault if something went wrong. And they took Volendrung with them because they still wanted to escape the wheel, so they stuck to that plan. They hoped they could literally use Volendrung to breach the shell that encloses Mundus, and hopefully find ways to breach the other shells too until they got off the wheel. I actually wonder if that's what the Rorken chieftain was really trying to do when he threw Volendrung. Maybe the whole clan panicked when the Alliance was formed because they figured it might cause a dragon break at any moment, so in a fit of haste, they somehow launched Volendrung into the sky hoping it would shatter the shell that encloses Mundus. That way they could point up and tell the other Dwemer, look, it worked, we don't need this alliance now because we can just use levitation magic or something to go through the breach. But regardless of whether or not that's what they were trying to do, we know it didn't work. But maybe Volendrung bounced off the sky and landed in the Alakir Desert, so the Rorken clan left to go get it. I think this idea is hilarious, so I'll stick to it, but sadly for the Rorken clan, regardless of their intentions, they were not spared from the Dwemer's disappearance. So the Dwemer vanished from this Kalpa as a result of time fixing itself, but what specifically caused this paradox? What exact events during the Battle of Red Mountain caused the Dwemer to never come back in time? Here are a few possibilities. First, perhaps it was Nerevar's death. He was the leader of the Chimer, so if he had lived he would have steered them in certain directions as a people. So his absence during the late First Era may have changed the course of history. Could be that the Chimer and Dunmer's descendants that would have went on to become the Dwemer never found out they were characters in the game, so they never sought to escape the wheel. Another thing that could have had the same impact is the existence of the Tribunal. They became Morrowind's leaders, and did steer them in certain directions all the way up until the late Third Era. The thing with that though is they didn't draw upon the heart until after the Dwemer disappeared, but maybe it became inevitable that they would during the battle. However, I don't think either of those two things are quite right, because remember in Coda, Jubal tells Numidium, you are the disappearance of the dwarves. So in Coda, Kirkbride's intent seems to be that Numidium is indeed the cause, and I believe that was his intent back in Morrowind as well. Balada's also attributes their disappearance to their anti-creations. As the Dwemer left no corpses or traces of conflict behind, I believe that generations of ritualistic anti-creations resulted in their immediate but foreseen removal from the Mundus. They retreated behind math, behind color, behind the active principle itself. That the Dwemer vanished during a conflict with Nerevar and the Tribunal is merely coincidence. So what did Numidium's existence change about history that resulted in its very makers not coming back in time to make it? Well, we can attribute it to pretty much anything via the butterfly effect. You just never know what could change the future in time travel. However, when we consider Kirkbride's whole vision here, there is an obvious answer. What does Numidium do in Coda? Or rather, what had it already done? It conquered Nirn and rearranged it into the Wheels of Lull, landfall, which happened in the 5th Era. But we don't know when the elves that became the Dwemer learned of their existence as characters in the game within their original timeline. So, perhaps it was later, maybe in the 6th or 7th Era. Thus, by initiating landfall, Numidium altered the course of history, making it so those elves never became the Dwemer. But what about Kagrenac striking the heart set all that in motion? Well, I think he did indeed activate Numidium in that moment. He saw the Dwemer had lost the battle and were out of time, so he made his final gambit to the Digitals by telling them, time's up, either you set us free, or I break the game. Then the Dwemer went poof, and without anyone to take orders from, Numidium just kinda stayed put. Or perhaps it was just biding its time because it knew it wasn't the right time for landfall yet. Let's try to make sense of how Numidium is always causing dragon breaks. The Dwemer traveled back in time with hopes of finding a way to escape the wheel. One of their attempts to do that was Numidium, an artificial god that was programmed to win the game, thus making it unplayable for anyone else. They intended to use this anti-creation as leverage to force the wheel's creators to let them out. When Kagrenac struck the heart for the last time during the Battle of Red Mountain, he set Numidium in motion. But the domino effect of that made it so the Dwemer were never born to begin with, because Numidium would go on to do what it saw as winning prior to their birth. This resulted in the Dwemer's mass instantaneous disappearance. However, shouldn't this have also made Numidium disappear, because if the Dwemer never existed, how could they have come back to create it? Well, what is Numidium? An artificial god, but not just any god, it was imbued with Lorkhan's divine energy. And as we know about Lorkhan and his relation to Mundus, one cannot exist without the other. So Numidium can self-create, thus exist despite the events leading to its creation never happening, which is a paradox that of course breaks time, it breaks the dragon. So it's always causing dragon breaks wherever it goes. Additionally, there is a way we can modify this same base theory that makes it so there is no paradox. Maybe the Dwemer's escape plan in a way worked. Perhaps the Digitals did indeed set the Dwemer free of the wheel when Kagrenac made his final gambit. However, the Dwemer never really understood what they were asking for because they never accounted for the possibility that their very desire to escape was part of the fiction. They sought to escape each layer of their reality to get to the most real world, but that was always because Kirkbride and his buddies wrote it that way. So when their threat to ruin the game with Numidium worked, it wasn't their real creators, Bethesda, that caved to them, it was the digitals of the fourth wall fictional world, which the Dwemer never knew existed. If that's the case, then where are the Dwemer now? Maybe they're chilling with the digitals in the fourth wall fictional world, totally oblivious to the fact that they're still fictional. The thing that's really ironic about that is that would actually make them less real than they were, because, they'd just be lore at that point. There is no fourth wall fictional world in the games, so yeah, it's pretty funny. And if their end goal was to get all the way back to the prime reality, God's reality if you believe in that sort of thing, then they're likely trying to escape that world too, but never will. Though it's also very possible that the digitals simply deleted them. They could have been insulted by the Dwemer's little Numidium threat and were like, "You want to be free from the wheel? Alright, here you go," and just deleted them in that instance. So the thing that's stronger about this theory is we don't need to justify the Dwemer's influence remaining after they disappeared because there is no Dragon Break. Nothing ever paradoxically makes it so they don't ever come back in time. However, it has a big problem. It doesn't account for Yagrim Bagarn. I certainly don't think the Digital's influence is limited to just Mundus like the Earthbones. I think they can reach anywhere on the wheel. The only place I think might be beyond their range is the Void, but I'm not sure of that by any means. So this is a solid theory from a logical standpoint, but the paradox one is more consistent with the sources. Yeah, I think when we look at all the source material, it really seems like Kirkbride's going for a Dragon Break with all this. Well, my friends, we've solved Elder Scrolls' greatest mystery. That is what caused the disappearance of the Dwemer. In light of all we've put together, there are some dialogues from Coda we should analyze. After Jubal removes his hands, he attends his cosmic bachelor party, in which various important characters from Elder Scrolls show up to talk to him. And since Numidium's broken time, characters that we know to be dead as of Skyrim show up anyway. The first dialogue we should look at is Jubal's conversation with Akatosh. And remember, this is a graphic novel, so some of the narration's going to read kinda like a screenplay. Jubal alone at a table as a man-sized dragon approaches. It has no legs or limbs of any kind, only small and useless wings. "May I sit?" Akatosh managed to coil itself around its seat. Jubal leans back, drunk off his ass. "Sit, will sit, didn't sit. How are you doing, worm?" "Not well, I failed you." "You're the god of time, you've always been on the clock. Clock's broken. Are you sure this isn't a self-imposed guilt trip?" "Maybe it is." Jubal has a moment of drunken clarity. He leans forward, holding up a bandaged wrist, forgetting for a moment he has no hand to motion with. "Hold on. Excuse me?" "I'm not sure, really, but I think you just said the magic word." "I know, but then, time is broken, and only we can mend it. We will erase you." Jubal and Akatosh stare each other down as Talos approaches. The latter is more Viking than Viking. His helmet has curled goat horns that are longer than his arms. His beard has to be wrapped up in his gigantic leather belt. In either hand, he carries a flagon of mead. "Walk away. You're drinking with the groom on your brother's dead body. Bad mojo that, in any world. Yours is an empty threat. We're spread too far for erasure now, but you knew that." Following the break. Animal picture, rude walker, go back to the lamp that stays lit in water and store no more messages of useless noise. Walk away, we've been through this already. Talos is closer, smiling like Brian Blessed. Proud residue, soon dispersed, serve no guarantees made in those movies and demand nothing of its underskin. I am the groom, walk away. Akatosh vanishes, leaving a greenish vapor. Talos, still holding the flagons, starts to sit. So Akatosh has failed because time is broken. He never should have allowed the Dwemers jump back in time or in their construction of Numidium, but they happened. As the god of time, he's responsible for landfall, and now Jubal now has to face Numidium. Yet Akatosh has hope that it can be fixed, which would erase Jubal and everything that came to exist as a result of time breaking. But Jubal tells him, no, it just can't at this point. Too much has been altered in this timeline and other timelines too. Yeah, there's just no undoing everything now. Jubal also brings up this magic word, which he'll bring up again in a little bit. Once Akatosh leaves, Talos tries to share some mead with Jubal, but he refuses. Talos keeps trying, then Jubal just spews a flurry of insults at him and calls him a virus. Then Talos finally backs off. Then Kine approaches Jubal to calm him down, and she manages to get him to give Talos a chance. So he shares some mead with Talos, then they start walking toward Master's surface together so Jubal can face Numidium. Here's what they talk about on the way. It starts with Talos asking the simple question, why did you call me a virus? Jubal responds, because 1, I'm drunk and I see it now. 2, because you were at one time. You fed off of it. mastery, and I can't really blame you, because the alternative means that one of us wins at the expense of the other, just because. Behind Jubal and Talos, Jubal points up to the great wash of light that was Nirn. See there? That's where all of us used to live, but not without a price. Dead language, old meaning, the arena. Arbis. Jubal and Talos continue to stare at the wheels of Lull. Talos, though, is starting to change. The platinum is going gray, the helmet he wears is fading from view. Correct. Now get this. All of us, in the end, we were just put there to fight. More like at the start. That's simplifying things on some level I don't get. Jubal Lunsul, you're lying. Jubal looks over at Talos, who has become Lorcan. Lorcan wears only a loincloth with the symbols of eyes stitched into it. His chest gapes open as a jagged hole. From it comes a harsh red glow the color of blood if blood was neon, and he has no heart. It should be plain, whatever ripped out that heart did so violently. Excuse me? Anyone that cuts off their hands, they already get it. They knew they had the arena in reach, but they decided to refuse it. Jubal watches Lorcan as the latter holds out his hands to either side. The blood-red hole of his chest grows an eye, a woman's eye. Okay, you caught me, Lorcan. It's just way too familiar, and it's way too seductive. You know why? Just saying, you've chased that answer your whole life. It was the easy way out. Exactly. The eye in Lorcan's chest is replaced again by the glow of neon blood. I should meditate now, time's almost up. And I've got work in the morning. I'm sorry I called you a virus. You're not, you're a preacher. Good night, give them all my love. Jubal sits down to meditate. Lorcan begins to draw a circle around him in the red dust of the moon. You're forgetting something. So Jubal called Talos a virus because of his conquest of Tamriel. He's using a virus infecting a body as a metaphor. But that was the drink talking. Jubal realizes that the alternative to Tiber Septim's successful conquest would have been worse. The individual provinces would have just kept fighting each other forever, amassing far more death than Tiber Septim's conquest ever did. Jubal then points out that there's a price for living within the wheel, and more specifically in Mundus, the arena. That price is conflict, because for games to be entertaining there needs to be conflict, so Mundus inevitably has a very bloody history. Jubal says that he doesn't understand why this has to be the case because he's trying to be humble, but Talos calls him out on that as he changes form to Lorcan. The fact that Jubal knew to have his hands removed shows that he does understand, because that proves he's not in it for the petty sense of victory that the Dwemer, the Aldmeri Dominion, and so many others sought throughout the events of Elder Scrolls. You see, there's this Elden Effects phrase that comes up sometimes, Gartok Altadun, which means something along the lines of hands as weapons. But really it's meant to describe our playing of the games because we, the Godheads, use our hands on the controllers to play, and we spend a lot of time looking at our characters' hands as they fight. So by cutting off his own hands, Jubal is refusing to take part in Gartok Altadun, in the competition of the arena. To be clear, he's not refusing the game like the Dwemer were, he's just refusing for existing within the game to mean having to endlessly seek victory over others, having to fight for eternity over control of the arena. But what's especially interesting is what this could mean about Lorcan. One of the most defining mysteries of Elder Scrolls lore is why did Lorcan create Mundus? Was it a trick like the Altmer believe it was, or was there more to it than that? This dialogue seems to give us an answer, at least from Kirkbride's point of view. Lorcan didn't cut off his hands like Jubal did, he chose to take part in the endless battle of the arena, heck he created it. As he tells Jubal, it was the easy way out, so why is that? Well, if there's no escaping the wheel, then you might as well accept existing within it for what it is, and try to make it fun. My guess is that Kirkbride is going for existentialism as the answer. If you're unhappy with the meaning you were assigned, then you should create your own meaning, which is exactly what Lorcan did. He rallied his friends together to create a world they could have fun in, the arena, a place where their imaginations were the limit. Sure, they were less powerful because their power had been redistributed to create all the wondrous things around them, but games aren't fun when they're easy. Anuics often complain that Mundus has lots of limitations, and assert that Lorcan was trying to make everyone else less powerful by limiting what they can do, while making himself more powerful by not limiting himself. But I think he was just trying to make the game fun. Games are just as much defined by what you can't do as they are by what you can. What would chess be without the limitations on what you can and can't do with each piece? The super-Anuic belief systems, like that of the very traditional Altmer, see the limitations of Mundus as compared to Aetherius as a bad thing, but in reality, they're what make existing within the wheel fun. The gods in Aetherius are just floating in nothingness with no clue about what they're missing out on. I also want to address when Jubal says, now get this, all of us, in the end, we were just put there to fight, more like at the start. That's simplifying things on some level I don't get. It's never occurred to me before, but I think I've figured out what the inspiration is for Tamriel being this arena, as the lore often calls it. One of the original Elder Scrolls devs, Julian Lefay, told the story of how the concept of Elder Scrolls became the open-world RPG that we know it as now. The original idea for the first Elder Scrolls game, Arena, was for it to be a gladiator-style fighting game, where players would have traveled around to compete in arena competitions like the Greeks and Romans used to do. And yes, that's why the game was called the Elder Scrolls Arena, and the fighting arenas of Morrowind and Oblivion are meant to preserve that original concept as, a little charm for longtime players. But eventually they added some side content to it, and the playtesters liked that better, so the concept of Elder Scrolls evolved into what it is now, the open-world RPG. So as Jubal said, in the beginning, the characters were simply created to fight, but just as the idea evolved in our world, it evolved in the in-game world. So yeah, I believe the inspiration behind this notion that Tamriel is an arena of powers and everybody inevitably fights over it was inspired by the original idea for Elder Scrolls. That's a really neat thing to think about, and assuming it's right, I think it's a great way to honor the original devs. So let's carry on with Coda. Lorcan just left Jubal so we could face Numidium. For this dialogue, we'll have to take some breaks as we're reading to make observations, because it's a long one. And most of Numidium's responses to Jubal up until the end are these blank text bubbles, so I'm not going to bother reading all of them, I'll just skip most of them. Jubal meditating in the circle. Jubal looking up at the Numidium, the shattered remnants of home beyond it. Hello. I guess you know the deal. I kill you now. No, really, I do. I tell you it was my plan all along, but you don't believe in those, do you? Plans, I mean. But you will. Would you mind, doing this face to face? Serial contrarian to the last. Just do it, for both our sakes. I promise no tricks. Jubal talks as the Numidium starts to shrink to a proper size. Thank you, I mean that. The others got it all wrong. Just get down here already. That's a good boy. Jubal talks as the Numidium continues to shrink. In those others, I include the ones who made you, the Dwemer, the dwarves, whatever. Numidium responds with another blank text bubble. Look, you don't have to respond to anything I say if you don't want to, but I already know you know that, so listen for once. Can you do that? Jubal talks as the Numidium continues to shrink. I'll take that as a yes, and I know that any kind of yes makes you do what you do, and that only ends in disaster, so hear me out. I'm going to start with some scripture for my people. So let's pause for a second to break this down. The Dwemer viewed any sort of affirmative thought, any sort of yes, as accepting their existence on the wheel, as accepting that as what's real, or at least as real as they're ever going to get. So they rejected all these yeses, and made Numidium out of that rejection. They were saying to the digitals, let us out or we break the game. And what Numidium does in response to a yes is destroy. It does exactly what the Dwemer intended it to do. It breaks the game. Jubal and Numidium face to face. Whoa now, just listen. I promise no tricks. Can I just... Numidium cuts him off with a blank text bubble. Okay then, after that I'll end with some words of your people. According to the codes of Mephala, there is no difference between the theorist and the terrorist. Even the most cherished desire disappears in their hands. This is why Mephala has black hands. Bring both of yours to every argument. Numidium spouts out yet another blank text bubble. I know, every word makes you angry. Wrong word, every assertion does, but just hear it out. The one-handed king finds no remedy. When you approach God, however, cut both of them off. God has no need of theory, and he is armored head to toe in terror. So let's analyze that. Mephala is one of the good Daedra, so she's Patomaic. This passage asserts that theorizing is bad, which it can be as proven by the Dwemer. Their attempts to understand the reality of their universe led them to a bleak and meaningless existence, because their refusal to accept the answers they found, that they're in a game and not in the most real world, made it so they couldn't enjoy the game, as Lorcan intended. Mephala also seems to know the secret of cutting off one's hands before facing God, in Jubal's case Numidium. There's nothing he could do with his hands that wouldn't set Numidium off. If he starts to argue, he'll start gesturing with his hands as one does and they're arguing, and Numidium will win by simply destroying everything. If he tries to fight, again Numidium will just win by destroying everything. So why bring hands at all? It's literary and pretentious, I get that, but the alternative, the words of yours, those are easy. Jubal steps outside of the circle. No, 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 no. Jubal and the Numidium face to face. I mean, really? You're just being a brat. Your philosophy is, for a lack of a better term, the entitled teenager. I know you wanted it to be something else, something more pure, maybe like never underestimate the little guy. But that just sucks too. It gets you nowhere. It got us to this. Everyone ran here to get away from you, to avoid you, landfall day 1. So let's break that down. The Dwemer's pursuit of being real was like being an entitled teenager. They were telling themselves that they'd been wronged somehow by being trapped in this wheel, but really their pursuit of realness was just greedy in the end. They wanted to be powerful, like God. And being that greedy is just a bleak and harmful existence. It hurts the believers and the people around them, as it did for the Dwemer when they were erased from existence, and the other inhabitants of Nirn when landfall happened. And for specifically Numidium, this endless need to win, well, what describes that better than the entitled teenager? But at some point in time, we all have to grow up. Help me with my scarbs, no hands of my own and all. Do it. Numidium begins to unwrap the scarbs, exposing Jubal's face. Let's face it, you were made to say, bleep it, but that's not an answer that lasts. But hey look, a lot of us took it to heart. Together, your people and mine, we joined forces and said, bleep that bleep, to the men that invaded our lands. Afterwards, yeah, we turned on each other, like people do, but we took you, because hey, bleep it, we won, we do what we want. Numidium and Jubal now truly face to face. Then some other men invaded us, and they weren't kidding around this time. Guess what? The only way we got out of it was to give you to them, because hey, bleep it, they won, they get to do what they want. Jubal walking closer to the Numidium. And the whole time, you were the escape route, you are the disappearance of the dwarves. As we've discussed already, Numidium's endless pursuit of victory caused the Dwemer to disappear because of a paradox they ironically did themselves in. Wasn't that hard to figure out, mainly because other people did before me, but there was always this one unanswered question, tickling in the backbrains. Here it comes, Jubal halts, he needs an answer. Why do you keep coming back? Red Mountain, Alinor, reclaiming all the time shouts from Atmora they took from you, stomping, to put it kindly, all of Hammerfell into the ocean, to, I don't know, remind its people of their history? And then you chased us here. What is the goddamn point? I mean, really, and I'm really asking, because no one has ever been, I think, brave enough. Do you have some kind of unfinished business? And at long last, Jubal gets a response from Numidium. Maybe. Jubal and the Numidium face to face. Jubal is pointing at the Numidium with an arm that has no hand. Don't you dare do that. That's the magic word, and we promise no tricks. Jubal and the Numidium stare each other down. Gray area. Gray maybe. I knew it. You just wanted to win. Yes. Finally. Thank you, and I'm sorry. The Numidium cocks its head. Jubal almost looks sorry for it. Numidium responds with a question mark. Don't you get it? Your people tried to run, but couldn't. My people have to run, and I needed to hear the way out. We're finally talking the same language. Jubal cuts the Numidium's head off with an empty text bubble. So a lot to break down here. Let's start with the magic word. It's maybe. So why is Jubal referring to maybe as the magic word? Well, because it's the ultimate declaration of potential, which is a defining characteristic of Elder Scrolls. You see, Kirkbride sometimes alludes to how Lorkhan intentionally failed to complete the Path of the Godhead. But he's never given a direct answer about why he chose to do this. The closest thing we've gotten is that perhaps he failed so that we might know how not to. But with everything I've gathered, I think I might be able to give you a more complete answer than that. We know that Lorkhan had some understanding that his universe was a game, and that he had the capacity to create himself since he created Mundus, so he had achieved the Sigic endeavor. So with all the knowledge entailed with that, along with just being clever himself, I think Lorkhan might have surmised that it's not really possible to transcend the wheel. I think he may have known that the Path of the Godhead, all this breaking the fourth wall stuff, was all just part of the fiction. So there was no potential for transcendence, but was there potential to create a world where he and his loved ones might have some fun? Maybe, the magic word. Lorkhan was displeased with the meaning that they had, so he took the existential route and created a new meaning for himself and the other gods. He didn't tell them the truth because he knew they wouldn't understand. Though I think some of them eventually came to understand on their own. So because of Lorkhan's realization, the Atada stopped floating in Aetherius and created a world defined by potential, where they could maybe tell some great stories, maybe see beautiful landscapes crawling with fascinating creatures, maybe know love, and so many more maybes. So the Elder Scrolls games began, and over the years this potential was seen very differently by various characters and us. For the Dwemer, it was potential for ascension, for Numidium, potential for victory, for us, potential for fun, and for Jubal, it seems to be potential for love, though I also think it might be potential for closure in his case, which we'll get to in a bit. So why does Jubal feel sorry for Numidium? Well, it plain and simply has always just been about winning for Numidium, because that's how the Dwemer made it. And he kills it by simply refusing to compete. In the absence of its purpose, it just dies. And Jubal feels sorry for it because that existence, being defined by this endless quest for validation, well, it sucks. Like, I know people like that in my life, and I'm sure a lot of you out there do too. It's a mental sickness. Like, it just deprives people of being able to have meaningful, happy lives. And yeah, I totally get what Jubal's saying here. It's like, how can you look at that with anything but pity? Heck, I was like that as a kid, and I never understood why people made remarks like that to me. Thank God I grew out of it. And you know, playing Bethesda games was definitely part of what changed me, so I could just grow up. And now looking back, I totally get why people felt sorry for me. At the time, I couldn't see how this endless search for validation made me miserable. It made me a frustrating person to be around, so I had trouble making friends, let alone girlfriends, and it sucked. But I learned my lesson. Numidium didn't. Once Numidium is dead, the digitals emerge and declare, no more wheel, no more lull. Then after a run-in with some ninjas, it's time for the wedding. Jubal's fiancée turns out to be Vivek as a woman. ESO recently added a sermon to the lessons of Vivek that tells of how Vivek arrived in this new form after the events of Morrowind. And at the end, Vivek actually predicts that Jubal will one day slay Numidium. For I have removed my left hand and my right, he will say, she said, for that is how I shall win against them. Love alone, and you shall know only the mistakes of salt. The worlding of the words is Amaranth. That final line is very interesting. In the original 36 Lessons of Vivek, the first 35 end with the line, the ending of the words is Om Sivi, and 36 ends with, the beginning of the words is Om Sivi, I give you this as Vivek. But this new final sermon tells us, the worlding of the words is Amaranth. So what does that mean? Well, my guess is that quite literally, Amaranth is the end, the final lesson. But the end of what? For that answer, we need the finished coda. So at long last, Jubal and Vivek are getting married, and Lorkhan is the minister, or whatever you call it in this case, that's marrying them. Once the bride and groom kiss, the hole where Lorkhan's heart should be fills in, and in the very symbolic closing section, the union of Jubal and Vivek creates a new man, an Amaranth. The final page is simply a coda symbol. So let's break that down. Lorkhan started the game, The Elder Scrolls, by creating the arena, a world that's said to have been made to satisfy his heart, which was ripped out. And in witnessing the union between Vivek and Jubal, the hole fills in, which symbolizes Lorkhan finally becoming fully satisfied. He got all he ever wanted out of Mundus. So the hole that once housed his divine center now houses something more meaningful than that: love, fun, and other happy things. He wanted to play a game, he did, and he had fun, but now it's time for the game to end. So how can it end? Well, this relates back to what we discussed about Lorkhan understanding that it's not really possible to break the fourth wall. This marriage has brought about an Amaranth, but for one to become an Amaranth, they have to face the Godhead, us, but that's not really possible. So what does that entail? It means this is where the game that Lorkhan started has to end. As the digitals put it, no more wheel, because the potential has come to a halt. There is no maybe to this new man jumping off the disc and meeting us. That's impossible. And this is another part of why Lorkhan didn't become an Amaranth himself. He knew it would end the game before it got fun. But with Jubal and Vivek's wedding, it was time. So the coda symbol on the final page concludes the Elder Scrolls story. At least that's the unofficial ending that Kirkbride wrote for us, and it's a very happy ending. And with that, it's time to wrap up. Wow, what a journey that was. To start with the origins and disappearance of the Dwemer, to go into some of the fundamental aspects of Elder Scrolls. Wow, how enlightening. That was great. This has been a good one. Well, my vocal cords really need a rest, right? So I'll just keep this conclusion brief. Please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video all over Discord, Reddit, whatever you got. All that's really helpful to me. Oh, and be sure to comment if you have something you want to add. I really enjoy comments about the really astral stuff like this, and I tend to be pretty good about responding to them too. Thanks again, everyone, and I will see you next time.